In the late 70s and early 80s, magazine listings were one of the primary ways not only for software to get distributed, but for people to learn programming. Many a star was born off of these sometimes hard to read pages of printout code. One of these magazines, one of the most important of them, was Softside. Today, we have a very special guest here on the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, a man who was the COO of Softside for several years. He's here to tell us the inside story of how a magazine like this worked, what day-to-day operations were like, and, well, I'll believe a whole bunch of funny stories. So, welcome to the show, Randall Kotwitz.
Thank you.
And hopefully I pronounced the name.
Kotwitz, yes.
Kotwitz, perfect. So, Randy, Randall or Randy?
Randy.
Randy, perfect. Randy, let's get started. Before we get to any of the fun stuff, we have to go back a little bit. Give me a little bit of background on you. Where are you from, education, and so forth?
From Blue Hill, Nebraska, where I am back living now after many, many years. But had moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan, went to Western Michigan University there, basically got a degree in theatrical design and management. Yes, as it turns out, all the world is a stage. But anyway, moved on from there. Actually, my first encounter with Softside Magazine was not with the magazine itself, although it was an advertisement in the magazine. And they also had a hardware company at the time. You know, the market was so small that people that were invested often had multiple companies. And the Softside also had a company called TSE Hardside. And Hardside was selling, well, some Apple IIs, but primarily semi-illegal TRS-80 Model 3s, ones that were being gray marketed, but also sold a tremendous amount of software for both the Apple II and the Trash 80. Some of it developed in-house, but most of it, we were some of the first to carry Bill Gates operating systems. It was, and nobody knew who the hell Bill Gates was. And we also nurtured Scott Adams and his adventure. He wrote for us for a while and then nurtured our eventual Adventure of the Month feature, where we developed an engine that people could write their own adventures. And that was a very interesting part of the magazine. Anyway, so went on. What they were looking for was somebody to drive a step van around the country to basically Howard Johnson's cheap hotels and set up in their ballrooms where people could actually touch and feel the software and hardware that they were otherwise buying by mail order. So they would do a mailing into an area that we were going to be there, and then nerds would come in and buy software.
Okay, I got to step back here for just a sec. So you have a theater background. Did you actually work in theater post graduation, or was this? How far away is this from your education?
Not very far. Okay. Not very far. I did some, as I said, all the world's a stage. My theatrical background ended up serving me very well in marketing. So I also did a lot of marketing work over a couple of years between my education and this offer coming up to go to TSE Hardside. So I guess it was my marketing background that made them look at my resume and say, oh, maybe we ought to talk to this guy. Okay. And so I took the job. I insisted that I went out and talked to them, and I met this guy named Roger Robitaille. And Roger Robitaille is really the heart and soul of Softside as you know it in terms of the coded magazine. He was the one who came up with the whole idea of putting out code in the magazine for people to type in. And he was in many ways the driving force behind the company before he hired me. And we became a very close partnership once he did bring me on board. And so anyway, I went out to meet Roger, and it was one of those things where we went out to dinner the night of my interview, and we ended up closing the restaurant and sitting in the parking lot of my motel in his car until like 4 a.m, talking about the business and programming and where computer magazines were going and where computers were going. And it was just an immediate alliance between our two brains.
So was this 1980 or 79?
Yeah, and let's see, 83, 82, 81. Yeah, in about 1980, 81, because I was there for about 2.5 years before things moved on.
Gotcha. Now, how experienced were you with computers then at this point, if you were talking coding and whatnot?
Well, you see, that in many ways, that was the magic that I brought to the party, because not much at all. I had well, first of all, I had taken a typing course in high school when my parents thought I was going to have a secretary, but I saw keyboarding coming, so I was a touch typist. Second of all, I had taken a computer usage course at Western Michigan University, working with a mini computer there. And that usage course, and literally they made us do a punch card project just to know what it was like to do a punch card project. But most of it was teletype and basic and typed into the mini. And so I had that level of experience. But I also was very much into home automation and futurism, and and clearly the computer was the core of all of that. If you didn't have that electronic brain, none of that stuff was going to be possible. And so I was interested and fascinated by all of this stuff. And I brought a very consumerish point of view to it as to where all of this was going. I was in many ways the anti-nerd, but not that I didn't love the nerds. Don't get me wrong. I got along with them pretty well. Hell, I could talk Pascal with a couple of my programmers. Let me jump past TSE Hardside first of all, just to say that project kind of failed in terms of the amount of revenue that it brought in. I did it for, I think, about 6 months and then was pulled off the road. And I was going to work on a new catalog, a new mega catalog for them, and was in the process of that when the editor of Softside Magazine quit. Dave was a very political guy, and there are lots of, it was the early days of the magazine publishing business. There are so many little minor politics going on behind the scenes. It's hard to tell you about whose relationship was who was falling apart, and because of those politics, somebody else didn't do that, and yada, yada, yada. But things fell apart, and Dave resigned as editor of Softside, and Roger Robitaille called me that night at my apartment and asked me if I would be the editor of his magazine. Oh. And I'll be honest, I laughed in his face, or laughed at the phone, and said, "You're crazy. I have no experience in computer programming whatsoever, other than this little bit of basic I had done on the Mini. I know nothing about editing magazines. I'd written, I had plenty of experience writing and editing and that kind of thing, but not for a magazine and not on a regular basis. I was the son of 2 teachers, so I was brought up with a lot of that stuff. But finally, what he said to me was, "But you know how to lead a company." Okay, fine. I was, I'd just lifted lock, stock, and barrel from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and moved all the way to New Hampshire, and had been working for the company for less than 6 months, and had no idea what I would do if I didn't have this job. And it all sounded quite interesting, of course, and I've never been one not to be up to a challenge. And so, I finally said, well, all right, I will do it on 2 conditions. One is that you will not object to my going to lots of professional seminars on magazines, because I have to learn how to do this. And so you have to give me the time to do that and pay for the transportation and education, et cetera, for that. And the other thing is that if it doesn't work out, you don't fire me. You find me another position somewhere so that I knew I had some sort of job security.
Oh, that's cool. That's very smart and forward thinking.
Well, I would hang by a wire. What choice? And he agreed. He agreed quite readily. And what followed was my going in and doing what I ended up doing as a consultant many times over for other magazines over the years after SoftSide ended, which was basically doing a survey of the company from top to bottom, sitting down with each and every employee for a given amount of time each and finding out what was working and what wasn't and how their job worked and that kind of thing. And by that time, having been around the hardware and software company and I'd read plenty of the magazines and that kind of thing, I had a good idea what I was dealing with, but did a basically top to bottom analysis of the company.
Now, just to have an idea, so at this point in time, there's 3 companies, essentially. It's the magazine, it's the software publishing side, and it's the hardware business. Or was the hardware business already shut down by then?
The hardware business was still in existence. It eventually spun off on its own and has its own sad story of losing to its owner had a brain tumor and lost it all eventually. But that got spun off sometime later. And that's its own story. We could be here for several days, you see, from that period of time.
I got all the time in the world.
Well, my handyman canceled his appointment today, so I guess I do too. Anyway, really it was 2 companies. It was the software publishing side of things was very, very small and was part of the hardware side. We had Mark Pelzarski's graphics editor. We published that for the Apple. Boy, there's a name I haven't thought of in a long, long time. Mark went on to be editor of one of the software magazines down in New Jersey. It was really just the hardware and the magazine. Well, and the owner, he had a little free shopper magazine, one of those that had car listings and that kind of stuff in it that was free in the grocery stores. Roger was a meddler in many things, and one of the things he had gotten into was typesetting. He had bought a used typesetting machine, and in order to utilize it and pay for it, he developed this little free shopper. And so typesetting was, and that ended up being key to what we were doing in SoftSide. It's going to be hard not to wander off into these little pocket stories.
Go for it.
So I'm just going to allow it to happen. You mentioned in the opening that the listings that people had to type in were sometimes fuzzy. And indeed, that was a serious problem because finding a way to get clear printouts of the basic line code that then could be photographed in the darkroom and transferred to the plates for the printing was difficult and not lose resolution along the way when you didn't start with much to begin with. And so one of the solutions, and SoftSide, I think you could say, was the only magazine that was devoted and stayed devoted to the whole idea of typing in code. All the other magazines that had code would have a program here or there or an issue here or there, but we were the ones that did it each and every issue and even tried to maintain it long after it was really a dog standing on its hind legs. So this was, our raison d'etre was code and getting it clearly in the magazine for people to type in. And what we developed was an interface to a CompuGraphic 9600 typesetter. And that took...
Now, sorry, I have to interrupt, but for those of a younger set, what is a typesetting machine, or what does this contraption look like?
Yeah. Basically, what a typesetter is it was able to do what a laser printer does today in terms of outputting very, very clear print at a time when we were dealing with dot matrix printers that were, you were dealing with literally 16 by 16 graphic blocks, I believe, for each letter to form them. I'm not a programmer, so I don't remember the precise numbers, but one way or another, the number of dots per inch in a typesetter was in the thousands instead of in the dozens.
Yeah.
And so as a result, and every magazine and every newspaper that you see from pre-laser printing days, really, was done with a typesetter. And in some cases, there was an interim period just before laser printers when you could actually output pages of type. But prior to that, and in the days of SoftSide, we were putting out what we called strips of type, which would be like a column in a magazine. So you'd have 4 or 5 strips across a page of a magazine to be the columns. And so what we developed was a way. And there was a whole different character set. It wasn't straight ASCII. ASCII, I can't even remember what ASCII stands for, but the straight ASCII set that every microcomputer had at the time. But because of typesetting, the typesetter had additional characters and that kind of things that we didn't want. And in this case, it was kind of a matter of dumbing down the typesetter to get it to do just very simple line listings that we wanted in strips of laser printer equivalent type that would then be sent through a waxer, which is a thing that puts hot wax on the back of those strips of type. And the art department would then use that hot wax to lay those strips down on a piece of cardboard, which was called a board, and there would be a tissue over that. And that would be the printed page in the magazine. And they would add the little page number and the little footer of SoftSide magazine and all of that kind of thing, all by hand, all little hand-cut bits of type that were run through the waxer and put in place with an X-Acto knife. And that's the way each and every page of that code was put down for publishing.
Wow, that's pretty freaking insane.
Yeah. And you see, now we got it down so it was a little easier. In the end, if you have the issues of SoftSide that have the pullouts in them, that the programming is in a separate booklet that pulls out from the center, those booklets were printed in wider strips of type that didn't require quite as much work. But when it was in the full-size magazine, when you actually typed in from the pages of the magazine, all of that was done the way that I just described.
Gotcha. Now, okay, I'm sorry for interrupting, but so now I kind of forgot where we were with the story.
Actually, one more little bit on the typesetting.
Yes.
And that was that my programming department was in a separate building from my art department.
Oh, no.
And so we hung what we decided had to be the world's longest RS-232 cable over the neighboring building and down into the building that the art department was in. So yes, we had the world's longest RS-232 printer cable to run that typeset.
Oh, Jesus. Now, and I've got to ask, because you guys were printing for various different machines.
Right.
So a lot of it was basic code, but you had PET, Trash 80, Apple II, and later on a few others come into it. How did that work? Because they did not output the same stuff.
Oh, no. Yeah, it was a stable of young geniuses is the only way that I can describe my programming department. Okay. We didn't do PET for very long. The Commodore stuff just didn't, and it wasn't a serious enough machine, and it didn't support enough stuff for us to be able to cross-translate. Our primary 3 platforms when I arrived were the Apple II, the Atari 800, and the Trash 80 Model 3.
Gotcha.
Those were the 3 that and our primary way of working, it was very much a user-contributed magazine. Many of those programmers came from many of the programs came from the readers. Now, we had a staff of programmers who would beef up and standardize and then translate those programs across to the other platform. Basically, our programming department was it had 4 quadrants, and it had Atari in one, Trash 80 in another, and Apple in another, with low enough partitions that the programmers could talk to each other over. And then we had, I think, about 6 programmers, and then some other machines off to the side. We had about 6 programmers most of the time, and many of them were high school students, either high school students or college students from the Boston area. They were young geniuses. And until you ran into areas where they weren't. Well, one of the things that I brought to the magazine was, again, that very consumerish point of view. I wasn't, although the games were interesting to me, I also was interested in things like graphics and personal finance and, what could a computer do for me? And we were working on a personal finance issue. And we were basically doing a basic checking account, financial management package in BASIC that would allow you to manage your finances. Lance, oh God, I can't remember Lance's name now. Lance somebody, one of our old programmers, had developed a package that we were then translating from the Trash 80 to the Apple II and the Atari. And at that time, I guess the IBM PC, we'd brought in the PC at that point. And my director of programming, a guy in his late 30s, came to me at one point and he said, we have a new problem. I said, what? And Bill and I were known for having interesting conversations. He says, do you know how hard it is to explain to programmers how to program a checking account program when they don't have a checking account yet?
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. Perspective.
Oh, that is brilliant. So, okay. Yeah, you were right. The jumping around is fun, but it's going to get me into a little bit of trouble here with my notes. So going back just a few steps, you came in and you did an assessment of the company.
Right.
Now, give me a brief overview of that assessment that you did when you got the position as editor. What did you find? What was the composition of the staff? What was the size of the company? What were the pros and cons?
Basically, all good people, all meaning well. I cannot say a really bad thing about any of the people that were working. But what I discovered was Roger had staffed the company the same way that he had hired me, which was talented locals who didn't really know much about what they were doing.
Okay.
So the only area where we really were very, very good was in programming. And I guess in the art department too, because there was really no choice but to hire professionals who knew what they were doing in terms of the art department. But in terms of circulation and marketing and the other departments of the company, the customer service, et cetera, they all needed beefing up, spiffing up, professionalizing, et cetera, as did the entire physical plant. It would be almost impossible for me to describe what I walked into when I walked into the physical plant. It was in an old mill building in downtown Milford, New Hampshire. And I told you about the little shopper, and it ran out of an office that was on the lower floor. And when you walked in, the entire stairway up to the second floor where the magazine began, the woman had a thing for frogs, and there were frogs everywhere, T-shirts, photographs, you name it, there were frogs on all it was, and just the whole atmosphere there was very sort of hippie New Hampshire chic, I guess. Basically what happened was, as we became a more mature company, which was really let me back up. Not only did I do an analysis of the company top to bottom, I did an analysis of the market.
Okay.
And it was clear that we had pretty much reached the maximum that we were going to reach if we were going to be a magazine stuffed with code. Because already the application programs and things were coming along for the microcomputers that people didn't need to code. Coding was either you were cheap and wanted to get programs in that you didn't want to pay for the commercial versions of, or you were a nerd and liked public typing in code. But one way or another, that universe was going to be very limited to us. And my mission, as given to me by the owner of the company, was to grow the magazine.
Mm.
And so my analysis was that not only, well, I guess long term, that we were going to have to eventually jettison, but certainly we needed to augment the code with other information about the computer business or about computing in general in order to build a readership beyond the code. And so I brought in an extra editor who was responsible for doing things like lifestyle articles and that kind of thing. We started doing more software reviews of the commercial software that was out there and available for people to buy and use on their computer. We did a lot of peripheral and, printer and we did a music issue and we did MIDI interface reviews and that kind of thing. So we started to build a magazine that went beyond the code.
Now, did you get any kind of pushback from existing staff when you started making these changes? Because, and this is something that I came across in my research, there's an actual editorial, the outgoing mail section, in an issue from '79 where they're basically, whoever's writing it, I just have the initials GWB, makes fun of the idea of somebody actually paying money for software because, there's no money in software.
Right.
It's a 2-page just lambasting anybody who thinks they're really going to make a proper living off of this. It's never going to go anywhere.
Oh, I wonder who that was. I wish I could tell you who that was because my guess is it was probably somebody we knew. There was a guy named George, and I can't remember his last name, who worked for Creative Computing down in New Jersey, and I suspect that this might have been something that he might have written. Yeah, well, we saw better than that because we saw it going on in our own other company. We saw the software selling.
Yeah.
And for not a small amount of money. Plus, one of the things I did early on was because I wanted to have the full experience that our readers did. And so I had an Atari 800 with my home computer. I had a Trash 80 and an Apple II at work, so I worked on all three. But my home computer was an Atari 800. And so I decided we did a database manager that you could type in. And I decided, what the hell, that will be the program. I will try typing in a program and have this experience. Well, it was the experience from hell. In terms of typos and all of, even being a touch typist and a damn good typist, and that was before we had developed, gosh, I can't even remember the name. We developed a utility that would look for typos, SWAT, I think, something against typos. My little genius programmers, I call them little because they were kids, but they were geniuses. They constantly were thinking about the users and how they could make the magazine more accessible and the software more accessible. And they came up with this little utility later on that you could run on your typed in software and it would help find the typos, which of course was critical to critical to any kind of software. So I had that experience, and I just overall could see that if SoftSide was to either thrive or even survive long term, that we were going to have to find some way to put the code off to the side and become a more generalized magazine. And I started writing editorials about the future of computing and the future of computers. And I guess it's not without a little bit of ego that I said I was right about a whole bunch of stuff. I predicted pretty much of the iPhone except for the phone part. I predicted a handheld in the future that would do basically everything the iPhone does, except I didn't see it as being a phone. But in terms of the utility that computers serve in our life and the way all of these things work together, it just seemed clear to me that once you could extend your brain and once you could extend the user interface, that these things were going to empower us in a way that took us way beyond.
Pardon me.
Oh, excuse me. Hang on.
9/11 films.
Yes. And so those editorials are still very interesting to me to go back and see what I was right about and what I was wrong about. But for the most part, I saw the future of computers in education and computers in our daily lives as it has come to pass, because we were striving to do those very things with the computers that we had.
Yeah. And so, and I have to go back again one step, because I think there's an important part of the puzzle we have to understand. We've talked now about the software publishing side of the business. Obviously, people know what a software publisher is today. What was the software publishing arm of a SoftSide like at that point? What was it doing? What was the extent of its capacities, and how did that business work?
Well, SoftSide itself did not publish software other than what was in the magazine. But, and this is again, we found a way to grow the magazine in a way that had never been thought of before. What we did discover was that people wanted the software that we published that they could type in, but they didn't want to type it in. And so what we could do was publish it either on floppy disk or, God forbid, cassette tape. And we had Apple and Atari and Trash 80 cassette tapes as well. There was some software that didn't lend itself to the cassette tape, but the thing that really got us was the software on disk, where we would put, and we would enhance that as well. We'd add little music programs or whatever, stuff that wasn't in the magazine on the disc, but just little Easter egg kind of stuff, that we'd toss on the disc. But so there was that month's disc. Well, if you take a magazine subscription that's $24.95 a year, and you add a floppy disk every month, which doesn't cost that much extra to send or to duplicate for that matter, suddenly you've got $149.95 a year magazine subscription.
Wow.
Which gave us a lot of capital to grow on.
Yeah, no, that would change the math completely.
And we were the very first magazine to do this. And in fact, one of my favorite stories was with Phil Kessler. Kessler Industries at the time was one of the only floppy disk duplicators on the West Coast. They did, for most of the commercial software developers, they did the duplication. And so when I needed to buy, and this thing took off. This thing took off like crazy. I think I needed 1,000 disks a month within like 4 months of starting this thing. We started with doing the duplication one disk at a time on our own computers in the house.
Oh, jeez.
And it just took off like a rocket. So it was like, okay, we got to find a duplicator to do this. And as I remember, it was 1,000 disks a month that I was doing. And I called up Phil, and I didn't know him at the time, but he was a very personable guy. And so we started talking, and I said, Phil, I need to know what it would cost me to do 1,000 disks a month, single master, with doing 12 months. So I need 12,000 disks over 12 months, 12 masters. There was this very, very long silence at the other end of the phone. he came back and he said, well, Randy, I can quote that out for you, but I have to ask, what are you going to do with all of these? We overnight became the largest consumer of floppy disks for duplication in the country.
Oh, wow.
Now, mind you, it was only 1,000 disks a month. Let's not blow those numbers out. But the industry was so small that even, there wasn't a Microsoft. Well, there was a Microsoft then, but it was very small. These commercial software developers would order 200, 300 disks, and that was a big order.
Yeah.
And
wow.
But I'll never forget that tone in Phil's voice. What are you going to do with all of these disks? Well, and of course, that then left us to be a pioneer all the way down the lane, because we didn't want to mail the discs separately. We wanted to mail the discs with the magazine, which meant we then had to deal with our magazine printer and how they could marry the disc with the magazine in the plastic bag in such a way that it wouldn't get damaged. And so all of this required a lot of technical, about the pioneers with the arrows in their back kind of philosophy. And we did everything wrong one.
Of course.
but we did learn one hell of a lot about mass software publishing and mass duplication and, and just to give you some perspective on what magazine publishing is like that most people don't consider, Softside Magazine at its peak had a circulation of about 24,000. That 24,000 magazines took almost a railroad car full of paper every month.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, you never, and here's the magic thing about the process, because everything was done in stages and things were moving out the door as they were being printed and published, never did you see all 24,000 magazines in one place. You saw a few pallets here and there, but I always wondered what 24,000 magazines looked like all in one place, and I never got to see it.
Now, and when you got there, what percentage, because we are talking about, like you said, magazines, the market was moving away from people typing in listings and more towards the purchase of ready-made software. What percentage of your magazines were still going out to retail stores, and what percentage were subscription when you first started?
Well, that was also a major change that we had to implement, because I don't know what to tell you in terms of percentage. I would guess probably 20 to 25% were going out through dealer sales and 75% through subscriptions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But that 20% was being handled in-house and handled very awkwardly and with a hell of a lot of manual labor, and not make it was at best a break-even proposition for that part of the company. So one of the things that I looked into immediately was commercial distribution and taking the magazine through traditional magazine distributors to the newsstand. That is its own kettle of fish, complete with payola, and I mean it's got its own stories connected to it in terms of how you handle getting a magazine to the newsstand and how that kind of sales works.
Okay, I have never heard from anybody about that. I'm all ears if you wish to share at least a little bit.
It's just little bits of, like, you have to perk the drivers on the major routes in the major cities to get them to make sure that all of your magazines get onto the stand, whether that's mugs and in some cases it's direct cash. Now, I never had to deal with the direct cash situation because, frankly, our magazine wasn't big enough to warrant it. But I have talked to publishers with the great big magazines who did actually do payola and cash. I just perked them with, little premiums and that kind of stuff.
Wow.
But, and here's something that I'll bet you never knew. If you put 50 magazines on a newsstand and 48 of them sell, well, first of all, 48 of them are not going to sell.
Yeah.
But even if 48 of them sold, those last two will never sell. And actually, the numbers work in such a way, and now, of course, with magazines being a thing of the past, this is not as pertinent, but what it used to be was if you put out a stack of 50 magazines, you wanted at least 25 of those magazines left because it was only the top 25 that sold.
Wow.
Can you imagine the amount of waste that represents?
Oh, tremendous. That's paper.
But it's the way the business worked. Eventually the magazine evolved to where the code was in a pull-out booklet in the center, a half-size booklet that was printed on, and you could pull that out. Well, it was for a couple of reasons we did that. One was it was easier to type from. But the other thing was that it wasn't in the newsstand issue. You would get either, because the booklet was also system specific. So your issue would have an Atari booklet or an Apple booklet or a TRS-80 booklet or whatever in it. But those booklets didn't at all go in the newsstand edition because the newsstand readers were not interested in coding. By that time, we had created enough of a magazine in terms of software reviews, feature articles, and all of that coding was no longer the primary reason for the magazine.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I believe Compute was doing something similar around that time or a few years later with their different versions for the different systems. So that must have been a pretty daunting logistical task then.
Every day was interesting time. Every single day. I I was learning so much about magazine publishing and computers and magazine distribution and printing because we were also growing. I mean, all of this was quite successful. So we needed a bigger printing shop. You know, the place where we were having the magazine printed couldn't run as many magazines as fast as we wanted on their press. So we needed to buy, we needed to go to a new printer. Well, when you're the publisher of the magazine and you're printing that much and spending that much, you get involved in buying the printing. And so I ended up flying out to Minnesota. We were printed on a full web press out there, which meant that they would do 32 pages at a time going through, and that 32 pages would be folded down into part of a magazine. And the amount of paper that went through that machine at the speed that it went through it was, and it was a printing press the size of a large house.
Wow.
Yeah, it was astonishing. It was just plain astonishing. So I was learning all of that at the same time that I was doing it. And luckily, and I really do attribute a great deal of it to luck, we found our way through. And we had a few missteps here and there. As I said, we did everything wrong once, but none of those wrongs were fatal. Some of them were costly, but moving to the newsstand distribution instead of trying to handle it in-house did make us some money and certainly increased the circulation of the magazine a great deal. I started recruiting contributing editors from important fields. I had a contributing editor for psychology because there was a lot of stuff going on about the psychology of computers. Trying to think of the name of the researcher from MIT who was just getting started at the time. But she was on, and I was going to seminars on humanity and computing and the ethics of computing and that kind of thing. Now that we weren't writing about that in the magazine, that was a little too heady for our audience, but it was certainly influencing the kinds of editorial that we were bringing on. I brought on Amy Choate Flynn as a graphics editor. Amy was doing graphics for traffic control systems in New York City and was bringing some of those mainframe and mini computer graphics over to the Apple II. And also Saul Bernstein from the West Coast, who was doing a lot of that. Actually, one of the very, very last magazines that was published while I was there, we published an art gallery of microcomputer graphics that we think was probably the first time that such a thing was done. And oddly enough, it ended up getting reviewed by the Dallas Daily News as an art exhibit.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That was our computer graphics issue. And there again, I wanted a little higher quality and I wanted a little better paper for it. And there was a way that I could basically print on another half of the paper that I did the cover of the magazine on and fold it over into the center of the magazine so that if you look at that issue, you'll find that those 8 pages in the center have a much heavier and higher quality paper and print for those graphics than the rest of the magazine.
Oh, really?
Yep.
So how do you even budget for something like that?
Well, interestingly enough, that particular item is a cheap way to get 4-color printing. Well, I figured out a long time ago that because if you think about it, as I said, if you're running a magazine through a printing press and you're printing 32 pages at a time, well, a cover is only 4 pages. So the printing press only runs long enough to print, what would it be, 8 out of 32, a quarter as many pages just to print the cover.
Yeah.
Once your printing press is running it for an extra 1,000 or 3,000 impressions costs almost nothing because your real cost is in getting it up and running. So if you plan your layout for your cover so that half of the sheets are covers and the other half are like your art gallery or in my case, I did 4-color promotions for mailings that otherwise would have cost me a fortune if I printed them by themselves. If you gang those two things up together and run the printing press twice as long, that second half costs you, $1,000 maybe instead of 10.
That is very well thought out.
This is the reason you go to the printer and you figure out how the printing press runs.
So you talk now about publishing the monthly compilation programs. Wait, one more thing about the inserts with code for the individual systems. Did you guys standardize the programs in each one so it would be the same program but translated to the different systems, adapted for each system, or would each system just basically get programs that had been submitted by outsiders or by in-house programmers for that system that month?
It was a mix. We always had what we called a master program, like that personal finance manager I told you about. We had a paint program in the graphics magazine. We had a music editor in the music issue. So there was always one master program that indeed, usually it would start with a submission from a reader. Then it would get beefed up. Sometimes one of our internal programmers would have a program, but usually it started with this. Then we would usually beef it up a little bit, add some features, dress up the interface a little bit, and then translate it across to the other platforms that we covered. So that one master program ran on all the systems and in approximately the same way, at least as much the same way as we could. I don't think there was an issue where we didn't have to have a note or two about, well, on the Atari version this or on the Apple version this. But they were very, very minor differences on that master program. And then sometimes we would have a second or third program that we could translate across the bases. Other times we would have individual programs for the individual platform. So the Atari would have 2 or 3 other programs, and the Apple would have 2 or 3 other programs besides the master. So it really depended on the month and our resources. The other side of this is we were publishing software on a deadline.
I was about to say, you're doing this turnover. You have to get the programs out. At the same time, they're listing, so you can't have like a massive code base. Were there submission guidelines for just how long the program was allowed to be?
I don't know about length, because we also, there was another thing, which was as the disk version took off, I think, gosh, now you're taxing my memory here. I think there was a point where we actually stopped publishing the master program in code, and the master program was only on the disks, and then the code that was in the booklets was individual to the systems. I'm not positive of that. I would honestly have to go dig in the basement through the issues to tell you whether it sounds like something we would have been looking to do. Understand that the long-term goal was to essentially get rid of the code, because that market, not only was that market not growing, it was shrinking, and it was shrinking fast. So it was clear that we needed to move on. And the other thing was Roger wanted to sell the magazine. And if we were going to go to one of the major publishers, we were going to have to be a magazine they could understand. And when we put code in front of them, literally, we may as well have been speaking Greek. They really didn't, maybe they got it, but they got it after half an hour's explanation. That's not an elevator talk. And in the end, we were very close. When SoftSide ended, we were very, very close to selling to Warner Publisher Services.
Really?
Oh, yes. We were talking a deal. There was money on the table. We had an offer on the table.
This would have been in '83?
Yes. I had spent a great deal of time in New York negotiating the deal, because they had taken over our distribution, so they knew our sales through distribution because they had their own distribution. So it was through. Then they decided they wanted their own magazine, and it would have happened too if it weren't for an astrologer.
Okay, now you have whetted my appetite like a true thespian. So now, tell me that story.
It's very sad. I wish I could tell you that there was a happy ending to Softside. There was not.
Well, the astrologer bit has gotten me, but yes, the sad ending is unfortunately, I kind of expected that much.
Yeah, well, the short story in terms of the staffing of the magazine is, to finish a little bit of what I said earlier, was that I had to professionalize the magazine, and one by one I handpicked individuals from across the country and moved them in to be circulation manager, art director, customer service director, director of programming. I hired the director of programming away from Creative Computing in New Jersey, and he immediately brought two of their programmers with him. And so I really had staffed the magazine up with people who really knew what they were doing. I was very pleased with the staffing that I'd been able to do. And I guess there's no way to tell this story without revealing that I entered into a personal relationship with Roger Robitaille. Yeah. We were partners for almost a year through that process. And I don't want to go into the details of it in terms of why it didn't work out, but it didn't work out. And as to whether that is the reason it ended or not, I have to say it certainly played a role in it in terms of Roger's willingness to follow the directions of the astrologer. And I will tell you that story. But there were times that it was good. There were times that it was bad. There were times it was very bad. And eventually, he at least realized that I knew what I was doing and was good for the company. So the only way for him to have his company do what he wanted it to do was for him to withdraw. And so he essentially, and he had another project. He had a software programming project he was working on at home anyway. And so he essentially withdrew himself from the company, and I did it by myself. And that was fine. I had a great staff of editors. I had a great staff of programmers. They were putting together a really quality product, just across the board. And we also moved the company, by the way, into professional circumstances in the middle of all of this, into a custom designed home. And in fact, it was the day that my nameplate was being put up on my door that Roger called me to his apartment, and we were flying high. Understand, we were about to sell out to Warner Publisher Services. Everybody's salaries were going to go up. He had given me 10% of the company at that point as part of my compensation. We were talking in the millions for sales numbers. So it was going to be a rosy day for everybody. And
what was the circulation at that point, approximately?
At that point, it was, 28,000.
Oh, nice.
And rising very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. It was such a fertile time. Everybody was doing it. People were literally walking into newsstands and just picking up one of every computer magazine that was there because they were trying to catch up.
Yeah.
So once we made it onto the newsstands, we were selling very well. But no, we were doing numbers very well, and Warner saw that, and they wanted to own it. Anyway, by this time, I will tell you enough about my relationship with Roger that he and I had broken up about 4 months before, and he now had a new girlfriend. And his girlfriend had taken him to her astrologer. And so he calls me to his apartment on this morning, and he tells me that he wants to play me this tape of his session with this astrologer.
Okay.
And it's a 90-minute tape, and I had to sit there for the full 90 minutes. And essentially what she told him was that he was going to make a great deal of money on this company, but that it was no longer his company, and that if he wanted it to be his company, he needed to get rid of me.
What?
Yeah. She was crazy.
Jesus.
And at the end of, if I didn't have crazier stories in my life for other times, I would have a hard time believing this myself. But I've had other crazy. But anyway, so tape finishes. I look at him and I said, so what you going to do? He said, well, I don't think I have any choice. And he fired me.
Wow.
Now, what happened next, I would never, ever have anticipated. And perhaps it's the most bizarre part of the entire story, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Wait. Even more so than this?
Even more so than the astrologer. And that was the reaction of the employee. I went back to my house and I called the office and talked to my associate publisher and filled her in on what was going on. And she immediately told the rest of the office. And they called me back, probably an hour and a half, 2 hours later, and they all wanted to come to my house that night. Well, okay. And we got 23 employees, I think. And out of the 23, 20 came to my house that night. And they wanted to know what to do. Remember, I had handpicked these people from all over the country. Even the locals had gone through an interview with me and had worked with me, and I was a very hands-on kind of guy. So I had very close relationships with these people. They were family to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so they show up at my house, and they all want to figure out some way to fix it. Well, there was no way to fix it. It was over. And we had, several of us, and Roger not included, had at one time kind of discussed the idea of a new magazine, that if we started Softside over to be what we wanted Softside to be, what would the new magazine look like? We had that. Well, we had about a 15-minute discussion that night about what that would look like. And geez, could we raise the money? Could we start a new magazine if everybody came along? You know, we were kind of a pre-made magazine company. And I said, look, guys, my signature is no longer at the bottom of your paycheck. I don't want you leaving your jobs for me for something I don't even know if I can do. And Bill, my programming director, stood up at the back of the room and he said, no, you're not our boss, but you are our leader.
Oh, that's the stand-up ovation moment right there.
I could not have been more grateful that my parents happened to be visiting from Nebraska that night and were able to witness that moment.
I'll believe it.
It still almost makes me tear up because I had invested so much of myself in that company, in that magazine, in that creative product, and in those people. Well, the next day, Roger came in and sat in my office, and I came in and got a few things and got his permission to take a couple of things off my desk that were company property, etc. Flipped him the bird on my way out. And basically, as soon as I had walked out the door, 16 out of 23 employees walked into his office all at once with their letters of resignation.
Wow.
Yeah. I still can't believe it. He couldn't believe it. I could have been a fly on the wall to see. I have such mixed feelings because it was the end of something that could have been something very special. Not only in the product, but in that family of people and what we could have produced together. And many of us are still friends. I still on Facebook today have 4 or 5 Softside staff members that are friends on Facebook, including one of the programmers and my circulation director, one of my editors. And you see, I went on, I don't know if you, well, yeah, you probably saw in my LinkedIn stuff, but I went on to work for Mac User.
Yeah.
And I was kind of fundamental in the Mac market. I wrote the most widely distributed book for the Mac ever called The Power Users. So I've got a whole nother few hours to do with you on the Mac industry and Mac User if you ever want to do that.
I did not want to just stop at Softside if you've got the time because, well, tell you what, I do want to get into that, but a few more things about Softside because
Sure.
It's a tragic end. But I did want to ask, so you guys you're selling the monthly discs. I'm guessing there's also probably negligible, but there's also a business of selling back copies of those discs or something, correct?
Actually, surprisingly large.
Oh, really?
Large enough that our distributor wanted to handle, and we pulled it in-house because the premium on it was enough that we didn't want to give it up to the distributor.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, it was worth devoting an employee to.
Okay. And then in addition to that, I wanted to find out what the relationship between the company and the contributors was. How did that relationship work? Was it just a flat fee? What percentage of the software was being done in-house versus sent in from outsiders? Were those long-term agreements? Was it a piece-by-piece thing? How much work had to be done to clean up code that came in? Things like that.
Wow.
Sorry.
That's all right. We didn't pay much. It was mainly bragging rights. As I remember, I think the most we paid for like a lead program was $250, $300.
Okay.
And we paid like an honorarium of $100 for some of the smaller programs. And we had an intellectual property lawyer who drew up a contract that basically gave us forever rights. We knew enough to know that we didn't want things that were going to be going away. And so we did have a significant contract that the programmers had to sign that gave us forever rights to their software when they signed it away, including future translations, so that if we took it to a different platform, we would be able to add it for that platform, et cetera, et cetera. It's a contract I would not recommend any software developer sign today. But at the time, it was a relatively safe thing to do. It really varied from month to month as to how much cleaning up we had to do on the code. And sometimes it was a very dynamic situation in that sometimes in the process of translating a piece of software to another platform, that programmer would discover a feature that was available on his platform that might not have been available or might not have been obvious on the original platform, but could be added. And so the translations themselves would often contribute to growing the master program on the main system that it had come in on, because those programmers would put their heads together and they would find ways to add features, et cetera. So it was a very dynamic situation, and a very noisy situation. Good grief, the racket that would come out of the programming department. I was glad they were in a different building from the executive suite.
Were they basically all just in one big space? Was it a cubicle farm? What did that programming room look like?
A quadrangle of 4 systems in the middle, and then some systems around the edges, and then the editor-in-chief had his own office, and not editor-in-chief, that was me, but the technical editor had his own office, and the programming chief had his own. But both of them were out of their offices so much that they may as well not have had 4 walls. No, it was pretty much a free-for-all. Well, and just to give you an idea, one time we were doing a lookalike for Frogger, and the Bill, my programming director, and I were standing in the hallway of the programming department. This was actually before we moved into the new building. And he and I spent maybe 10 minutes discussing the sound that a frog would make when it was run over by a car in the game. Well, because we not only had to consider what the sound would sound like, but whether it could be duplicated on the 4 systems, yada, yada, yada. So we had this 15-minute conversation about what sound a squashed frog would make. And as we were finishing up and going to walk away, I said, Bill, do you have any idea how much money this company just spent on 2 executives figuring this out? They were heady days. They were heady.
Well, and this begs another question. I mean, doing a clone of Frogger, obviously super popular arcade game. Do you guys start with the idea of we need to get a version of this on here? Does somebody submit a version of it?
I'm pretty sure that was a submitted program.
Oh, okay.
I'm not positive, and honestly, that was before I was as heavily involved in programming as I eventually became. But I'm pretty sure that the original was a submitted program.
Gotcha. And I'm guessing you guys didn't really care about copyright infringements or anything like that at that point.
Yeah, I'm afraid we flew a little bit free and easy when it came to that. I've forgotten what we called it, but we didn't call it Frogger, obviously, and we were prepared to go to battle, but we never had any problem. When we were doing that kind of stuff, we were such small potatoes that nobody cared.
Gotcha.
Now, if we had continued to do that as we grew, I'm sure we would have drawn the wrath of the major game publisher. But in the early days, nobody cared. They were just, the microcomputer gaming market was so small that nobody thought there was anything serious to be had there in terms of profit. Computers were so expensive, nobody was going to buy them to be gaming platforms.
This is true. It didn't make a lot of sense. Yeah. And at some point, you guys started to also I guess, and this is a relationship I never quite understood through TSE, the software side of things. You started also selling other publishers' programs like Muse Software and Adventure International and so forth.
How
did that work?
Went away way early. That was true when I got there, but that went away with Hardside. TSE Hardside all went away all at the same time.
Okay.
And that was in early 82 or late 81, that Roger decided to shut that company down. And then it was revived with one of his former business partners a couple of years later, but it was dormant for a couple of years. And the new Hardside was a very different company from the one that Roger shut down. But honestly, that the selling of other people's software, especially where we were selling advertising to those companies, the conflict of interest would have been just really difficult to deal with. And so, no, we didn't sell other people's software. We sold some of our own. Roger had a program called Environ, and please don't ask me to explain Environ at this point because that would take another 2 hours. But it was one of the first spatial databases. The concept was where something was important as what it was. And so you could, do mapping and that kind of thing as a database, and et cetera, et cetera. And we sold an engine for that, for developing 3D adventure. We did have the Adventure of the Month Club, where we provided an engine and we had contributors who wrote adventures, and then we would resell those. But it was all our exclusive products that we were reselling. We were not reselling other publishers' products.
Okay. Well, because there were ads running that said, available through the TSE, the software exchange. And I'm guessing that it may have just been advertisements and that logo was added to it.
Exactly. That's exactly what went on. And that was, you're looking at the issues of the magazine. In fact, you might not find my name on those magazines because I came along after those days, or at the very end of those days.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I'm thinking mid to late 81. There's still some of that popping up.
I was hired. Yeah, I would have still been out on the road.
Okay.
I was definitely not editor of the magazine, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense then. And so...
It's interesting to me as you'd ask me these questions at how much happened in how short a time.
It really does almost feel like month to month the world changed.
It felt like that at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of insane. So
I remember when the IBM PC came out, and we were absolutely sure that they were going to dominate the market. And of course, eventually they did. Not so much with their hardware, but with the Microsoft operating system. But their hardware was awfully popular as well. But we drove down to New Jersey in the middle of the night to pick up some of the very first IBM PCs so that we could have software out as quickly as possible in the magazine.
Wow! And what did it feel like? I mean, it's 16-bit processor and everything else. How long did it take you guys to size up the machine and to figure out whether or not it was going to be or how relevant it was going to be to your audience?
Oh, about 48 hours of the programmers crawling all over it.
Okay.
It was clear, and including Roger. Roger had his own machine. We bought a machine for him, but I think we bought 4 machines on that first trip. And it was just really clear that both with the technology that was there and the IBM name behind it, we had to pay attention. I am to this day not a PC person.
You wrote the book on the Mac.
Well, exactly. Well, because you see, and again, if I were to choose between computers and publishing, I would choose publishing. Publishing ended up being just such a fascinating profession in and of itself. And the fact that what I was publishing happened to be about computers was its own thing. But of course they merged, desktop publishing, duh. Well, I remember I told you about being on basically a long leash in terms of Roger letting me go to all these publishing seminars and publishing conventions and that kind of thing. One of the things that I did was to go to the Folio convention every year in New York. And Folio is the magazine, or used to be the magazine for magazine publishers. And their annual conference brought together the best and the brightest of the entire magazine publishing industry for seminars and discussions, et cetera, et cetera. I met many of my mentors there who ended up being tremendous assets to me in the Mac industry later on when we were doing Mac User. But at Folio, one of the things I went to was the Future of Publishing seminar, and there I saw the Xerox Star system.
Oh, cool.
Complete with mouse icons, et cetera, et cetera. And I saw them. I'll never forget, it was because Time Inc. at that point had adopted the Star system for their publishing. And I'll never forget them showing me a cover of Sports Illustrated where there was a guy a player making a jump shot, and there had been another player under his arm, and they had been able to remove him and replace it with the background.
Wow.
In 1982.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. And I remember walking out of that seminar and going, because Roger was there with me, and I went to him and I said, I've seen the future and it ain't what we're doing now.
Mm.
And that was also, graphic user interface and high res output. And I mean, there were so many things that came with the Star system. And as a result, I was able to convince Roger that we needed to buy 2 Lisas. Remember the Lisa?
Yeah.
Well, we were, at the time that Softside closed, or I was kicked out the door, we had converted, I had a Lisa, Roger had a Lisa, and we were considering whether we were going to cover it as a system because it was so revolutionary. I was doing, in fact, I had my entire spreadsheet for running the company on Lisa, believe it or not. And those stupid Twiggy floppies, those stupid, unreliable, the most ridiculous removable media Twiggy floppy ever done.
Okay, you're going to have to clue me in. I've never heard of the Twiggy floppy.
Twiggy floppy, like Twiggy the model.
Yeah.
They were just really high capacity, and they felt like a regular floppy disk, maybe a little thicker, but they were so unreliable. You would end up having to reinsert them multiple times, and I hated Twiggy, and they were very expensive as well.
I'm looking at a picture of one right now off of Google. Did it have 2 read heads?
Yes.
Oh, Jesus. Okay, yeah. So you're just doubling the number of failures you could possibly have.
Exactly.
Oof.
But so we had those 2 Lisas, and we were preparing to do something. We weren't quite sure whether we were going to have to write our own publishing software to do desktop publishing on the Lisa, or whether we were going to have to buy a Xerox Star system for the art department. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to do, but we were going to do something, because it was clear after I saw that Star system that the future of all this waxing and pasting and photographing and all of that was going away.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, jump forward to 1985. I'm at the Boston Computer Society show in Boston, and I don't remember whose booth it was. It was somebody else's booth, but there was somebody with an appliance Mac in the back corner, and it was where, as I was walking by, I could see what was going on the screen, and I stopped, and I saw what today we would think is nothing, pouring type into a template, just taking like desktop publishing, taking an icon that had type in it, clicking and dragging, and putting type into the place, and it being there in high resolution.
Oh, geez.
On a Mac, on an appliance. The program was called Mac Publish. Rather clunkily made and didn't survive very well, but it was an attempt, and it was a very good attempt. Not a page maker, but I knew the world had changed the moment I saw that. And I went back to my staff at the time, because I had my own consulting company by that time, Kowitz and Associates. And I went back to my staff and I said, everything we do from here on in is on the Mac. And we we were leaning that direction anyway, because we had been at the introduction of the Mac. Oddly enough, if you go back, there's now been a video released of the introduction of the Macintosh to the Boston Computer System. And if you go back through that video, you will see me with very long hair and my staff sitting literally in a row in the auditorium in such a place that when we looked straight ahead, we were looking eye to eye into the Mac developer team's eyes as they sat at the table on the stage. I had my team, Steve Jobs had his team. I obviously didn't have the potential that Steve Jobs did. But I was the same age and had brilliant team members, and we went on to work for a number of different magazines and software publishers and hardware manufacturers and that kind of thing. But I was no Steve. But it was a very interesting night. I will never forget Steve walking onto the stage and setting that Macintosh down on the plinth, and it said hello. The computer said hello. Again, today, nothing. I want my computer to shut up. But it was just astonishing, and the world changed. And I feel a certain loyalty to that platform for what it has done for my life. And people always make the mistake of thinking that Apple is a hardware company. Apple isn't a hardware company. Apple's a software company. They happen to have to make the hardware for the software to operate the way they want it to, but in the end, it's the software that sells Apple. And the software is damn close to a lifestyle.
Or a religion, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, well, let's not go there. I mean, honestly, there are those who are over the top. There are those that are over the top with everything.
This is true.
But when I think about what this iPhone means to me and how much I'm 66 years old, just turned 66. I live by myself in a big house in a very rural community. I'm 20 miles from the nearest town of 25,000. I live in a community of about 1,000. My friends are all over the world, especially all over the country. And if I didn't have the connection that I have through this phone to them, whether it's by Messenger or texting or Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever the way it is that we communicate, I can't imagine how lonely my life was at this point and how desperate I would be for human companionship.
Very true. Very, very true, that.
And that's not exclusive to the iPhone or the Macintosh platform, certainly. But I can't help but say everybody else is a bit of a copycat.
There's some truth to that.
The Mac did it first. The Mac continues to do it first. Steve is no longer with us, but the spirit of the company is certainly there, and I think the current management is maintaining the spirit of the company pretty damn well, especially given how large they've grown. When you consider the size of Apple and the evil empire they could be, I think it's pretty amazing that they're no more evil than they are. Well, if you think about it in a general environment.
Well, I guess what they're missing for the evil empire thing is market share. They're extremely wealthy and extremely profitable, but they've never had the market share to become an evil empire.
And they never worshipped market share as their god.
I don't know if they didn't. I think they may have wanted to. They just were never in a position to.
Maybe in the Scully years.
I'm thinking the first job years. The initial jobs years.
But that's just ideal. If you consider, the world was their oyster at that point. And that youthful idealism of, they were going to knock IBM off of the mainframe platform as far as they were concerned. And let's face it, in the end, they did.
Well, yeah. Well, because, the mainframe idea didn't really make any sense anymore at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I would say unless you put market share as your prime directive for success for a company, unless you have that as your prime directive, the rest of it, they have succeeded extremely well.
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely.
And I don't think they could have had the quality that they have in their products, both software and hardware, if they had worshipped the god of market share.
I definitely agree with you on that, because they wouldn't have had the niche reputation that they have if they had gone for market share.
Exactly.
And they also wouldn't have been able to, well, I mean, a lot of what they can do is because they go with a premium product. They're always ahead of the curve, but they also have the price tag attached to it. I mean,
yes and no. Yes and no. I will. Yes, currently an iPhone is more expensive than an Android, pretty much for features. But here's the argument that I will make on the computer front.
Okay.
If you take a standard PC, maybe not quite so much these days because PCs have become so damn cheap, but if you take a standard quality PC and you add all of the features to it with high quality graphics cards, et cetera, to make it equivalent to the Mac that comes out of the box, the delta between the two is not going to be much.
I concur, but Apple does not offer a cheap variant.
This is very true.
And this is why there's never a cheap Mac on the market. There's never a cheap Apple II on the market.
Right. But, there is a valid philosophy for selling things that way.
I agree, yeah.
As a cook, I think about Cuisinart. There is no such thing as a cheap Cuisinart food processor.
Yes.
And there are other brands that I can think of that way, that they have opted to go for the premium price, premium niche market successfully. I would argue that the iPhone is not so much a niche anymore.
Yeah, but it's still, maybe not even 20% of the market in the U.S.?
How old are you?
I was born in 76. I actually just last week turned 45.
Well, I just turned 66. The thing is, because I was so young when I got into computers, I knew I wanted a computer of some sort when the Apple II first came out when I was 24. I got my job working with computers for the first time at 26.
Oh, wow.
Most of the people my age didn't have computers come into their lives until they were much older, because they weren't actually working in the industry. They had to move. It wasn't until computers moved into whatever industry they were working in that they had to adapt to. So for someone age 66, my experience with computers goes back a lot further than most. So I am generally far more comfortable with the technology and the day-to-day interaction via technology, the extension of yourself that the technology is. All of that makes perfect sense to me, because my paradigm was altered fairly early on.
You're right. I mean, even in my generation, I got my first computer when I was 8, and basically lived with it as a C64. And my first job, put that in quotation marks, was working in a software store when I was 13.
Oh, my.
Yeah. I mean, I hung out there the whole time. And then one day, the wife of the owner was trying to sell an IBM compatible, and she had all these kids trying to buy software, and she was torn back and forth. I just walked in, started taking people's money, started handing out software and stuff, and then she asked me if I wanted to work there part-time, and I said, sure. So I just basically started hanging out there after school. And I didn't stick with computers. I went into other things, but it always was sort of a thing in the background.
Right.
But it's also uncommon. My generation, I mean, the number of computer kids in my school when I was a kid was extremely small. You kind of had to hunt the people down who knew something about computers at all.
So you get what I'm talking about in terms of
definitely.
Because this is, and hell, I wrote about it when I was at SoftSet, and I still wonder about it, because with the technology evolving at the speed that it is, and these kids that are coming along where the computer is, and now the phone is so much a part of their paradigm from the day they're born. What kind of ideas and creativity are they going to bring to this platform that we are literally incapable of imagining within our paradigm?
I have a very sad estimation of that, because I'm currently a university professor.
Uh-huh.
They may have been born into this world. They may use the devices on a day-to-day basis, but because they have never programmed, because they have never gone beyond the graphical user interface, I am constantly, and I mean literally almost on a daily basis, confronted with people who don't even know how to format a Word document.
Oh, good grief.
They don't even know how to set margins.
See, I thought coding was the new thing.
No, coding is as dead as a doornail.
Interesting.
What's happened is that it's like driving a car. I honestly know how to drive a car. I can drive the car everywhere. If you put me in front of the motor, I have no idea what's going on under the hood. Right. I just know I push the gas. That's how they're interacting with computer tech.
It's too bad. You see, that's where I'm really grateful for that computer usage course that I had in college that went all the way back to the punch cards. Now, I understood punch cards already because my dad was a science teacher and had gone through an advanced program on the East Coast where he had done computer programming with punch cards, so I understood them. But there still was a matter of handling them and understanding bits and bytes and zeros and ones, and there is a fundamental understanding of the basics of computing that I have that means that I can explain the little man in the machine when other people just know that there's a little man in the machine. If that makes sense to you.
It makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I have a very, very basic programming background. I mean, a little bit of BASIC on the C64, and then later on Pascal, and programmed quite a bit in Visual Basic when I was a teenager. But this fundamental idea of understanding how the things are working. I mean, I did a lot of graphics stuff on the Commodore 64 as a kid, and the Commodore 64, the way it built graphics was, 16 colors, but you can only do 3 in each block.
Right. You pretty much so many down into the wiring to make that work.
Exactly. And so once you've had to do that, it's suddenly when you're confronted with those limitations of the machine and you start to have to think, well, how is the computer doing this? It gives you a different perspective. And I think, and I tell all of my students, I mean, I teach business and law classes, but I tell each one of my students to take a programming class, an introduction to programming class, because it's such a fundamental aspect of understanding the technology that we live with every day, but also understanding just basically how to organize your thoughts into a logical progression.
Well, and I think what it does, logical, and it gives you logical expectation.
Yes. I never thought about it that way. That's amazing. I got to keep.
Yeah, because if you understand at a fundamental level what a computer can and can't do, then you know what your expectations are of what it can and can't do in terms of more advanced application.
Exactly. Which also explains, I've seen some of these kids try to do Google searches, and you're like, have you ever done a Google search before?
Oh my God. I can't tell you how many times people will say, well, they'll ask me a question and it's like, do you have a phone? Have you ever heard of Google? I am just astonished at people's inability to think of keywords.
Exactly. It's like, why are you using the most common word when there's a very clear uncommon word in the middle of all this?
Exactly. And it's not rocket science. This is not stuff that should take an advanced degree to understand.
Yeah, but the problem is they're not getting it from their parents because their parents didn't go through it.
Right.
And even the people who could have gone through it, and I've had this conversation with a few developers over the years. Probably the best one was Al Lowe. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's one of the adventure game designers over at Sierra, did the Leisure Suit Larry games. But he made a great point because they were selling their adventure games, selling gangbusters, and they would sell to a significant portion of the installed computer users. And then when the internet came and everybody started buying Windows-based PCs, they expected their sales to increase at the rate that the computers were selling.
Right.
And suddenly that didn't happen. Suddenly their sales plateaued for the adventure games, but the machines kept selling. And that's when they came to the realization, these are his words, the people who wanted adventure games, these people who wanted to figure out how systems worked, were the ones who were buying the computers in the first days. The ones who are buying computers now did not want to have to figure those things out. They just wanted to be able to click on things and make things, and it would work.
I would argue that there's also, I mean, certainly adventure games came along with a lot of graphics and stuff later, but I would also argue that there was a fall off in interest in text-based gaming versus graphics-based gaming.
Very much the case, and they did make that transition to graphics-only interfaces.
Right.
But even then, it didn't say it did not increase it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it was just this fundamental, these were not people who were going to spend 30 hours of their lives trying to figure out, which item do I combine with which other item to get to the next item.
Right.
But that's, it was basically game designed by programmers for programmers.
Right. Right. Well, that's the reason we were able to develop our adventure engine. It really was a very simple A plus B equals C kind of formulaic thing in terms of making adventure games.
And Scott Adams, I believe, already had a relationship with Softside before your time there, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Well, and really afterwards, we just maintained a friendship. He just moved on. That's all. Scott wrote, back in the TSE days. Actually, you keep going back to TSE. TSE did sell some of Scott's adventures in the very early days, and I think, if I remember correctly, we may have printed the booklets for them. I'm not sure of that.
Oh, okay.
But I think maybe we were involved some way in the production of those early adventures. I remember handling them in the warehouse when I was doing that road trip thing. But Scott remained a friend of Roger's, and he was always very friendly to me when I would see him at trade shows and that kind of thing. So I would not say that there's anything there other than Scott. When the magazine became what the magazine became, Scott moved on, and he was already selling enough of his own adventures that there was no real competitorship.
So Softside, your involvement with it is done. You're out of there. What is your game plan at this point?
Well, my roommate at the house was also the technical editor of the magazine, Steve Birchall. And Steve and I had talked for some time about where we were taking Softside and where it was eventually going to be. And we were going to spin the code off into its own little digest magazine. And we were going to become a mainstream lifestyle computer magazine. And indeed, what we were thinking of was the Better Homes and Gardens, or the metropolitan home of computers, that this would be modern technology, not only in the form of computers, but the other forms that computer technology would take in our homes. Much of how we live today, with Wi-Fi, refrigerators, and dishwashers. And we were literally talking about that kind of thing in what we were saying the technology could do. So we put together a project which we call Living Technology. And Living Technology, it never actually lived, but oh boy, did we put it through its paces. I told you in our last interview about going to the Folio conferences in New York City and really getting to know some of the big players in the magazine publishing industry. Well, if I was going to start a magazine, it was time to trade on some of those relations. And one of the people that I had met and taken a seminar from was James Kobach. And Jim was doing business modeling with the equivalent of spreadsheets on mini computers before there was a VisiCalc.
Oh, wow.
So he was not only a publishing pioneer, he was a computer pioneer. And so he really got it. He had that cross patch of experience between computers and magazine publishing, that he could see what we were trying to do. I did not know him. I had taken a seminar from him and I had met him. That was all. And he was considered, I would say Jim was considered one of the 2 or 3 gods of the industry at the time, and was for decades thereon. And he's still alive as far as I know, but I'm pretty sure he bought the Kirkus Review of Books at one point as a retirement project, I know. And we have fallen out of touch. But anyway, I did not know him, but my my associate publisher, she acted as my secretary at the time, but she really was my associate publisher. She made a call to his office and was able to secure an appointment with him in New York. And he had a permanent suite at the Roosevelt Hotel. Jim was his own character. Actually, all of these major players I have to talk to you about are major characters. They just a man's level of genius is exceeded only by his level of eccentricity. I told you about that last time. I live by it, and all of these people have fit that profile. Jim never wears long pants. He only wears Bermuda shorts. And even to weddings and bar mitzvahs, it's what he's known for. It's kind of part of his reputation. As I said, he has this permanent suite at the Roosevelt, and he has offices in his home in Darien, Connecticut. And as I said, was God. And I certainly, over the years, I've got to be quite professional at magazine publishing. But at the time I met him, I was so wet behind the ears. I barely knew what I was doing. Yes, we'd had some meetings with Warner Publisher Services to sell them soft side, and I'd been in the New York publishing circles a little, but not to meet with God in his own suite in the Roosevelt Hotel, Mm. And what I had was a spreadsheet, and because I had done a 5-year business plan in a spreadsheet, and not only, and it wasn't mounted on anything. We didn't have portable computers or anything. I had strips. I had literally strips of dot matrix printout. And we literally were laying them out on the floor of his hotel suite and crawling around on the floor and looking at, what's your assumption about, how many subscriptions you're going to get in your second year? Well, that's reasonable. Well, that plays itself out in the profits over here. And,
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was rather a bizarre scene. I'm in full mufti, I'm in suit, tie, 3-piece suit, the whole 9 yards. He's in his Bermuda shorts and his Lacoste shirt. Crawling around on the floor was a little easier for him. And I'm like sweating bullets because I'm in the presence of God. And so we spent probably 45 minutes, I would guess, talking about the concept and looking at the spreadsheet and that kind of thing. And I will never forget his sitting back on the couch and looking up at me and saying, well, yeah, I'll work with you. Wow. Now, mind you, I already knew the deal with Jim was you didn't pay him a thing. He got a percentage of the deal. So this not only meant that he was willing to work with us, but he had blessed the deal. To give you some idea, just to jump ahead in the story, what that means, when we eventually were sending out business plans under his name, I will never, because his secretary would always send me copies of the cover letters that went out with the business plan, and I'll never forget the one that he had sent to Catherine, I can't think of her last name, at Newsweek and the Washington Post, Catherine. It's completely escaped me at the moment, but if I said the name, you'd see that she was one of the biggest names in publishing ever, Katharine Graham. And he had crossed out, it just when he signed the letter, he had run a cross out through Catherine and put Kathy in. He called Katharine Graham Kathy. That was the level I was playing at, in terms of the international publishing industry. Anyway, so he sat back on the couch and said, yeah, I'll work with you. And what followed was several months of building this business plan and incorporating it into such a way that it could be bound up and actually looked at with sample tables of contents, just a full business plan. Well, it was like a 35-page business plan and then like a 200-page appendix that had sample articles and sample tables of contents and that kind of thing. We worked very, 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 very hard at getting it done. And of course, we were working with the guy who knew how to do it. Jim was the guy who saved Playboy. He's the guy who completely revised Playboy and saved it. He was one of the launchers of Psychology Today. He literally was a god in magazine publishing. Now, on a separate line, because I had an interest in Better Homes and Gardens and wanting to be a part of that, and I had been a mentee of the publisher of Better Homes and Gardens, Jim, a different Jim. I had approached them. And once we had the business plan, I personally sent them the business plan, didn't go through Jim Kobach. Jim Kobach sent them out to all the other publishers. And I also approached a few people like Pat McGovern at International Data Group, IDG, and who else did I approach? I'm trying to remember. Oh, we did. The pornographer. I can't remember his name.
You mean Larry Flint?
Larry Flint. Yeah, we went after Larry Flint. Now, mind you, not only he turned us down, but the adventure of going to his office for the meeting was worth it. Just to say you'd done it. It was quite bizarre. It was quite bizarre. I mean, but then meeting Felix Dennis was quite bizarre as well. And that was another one that I had approached because of his interest in computer magazines. He had almost bought Byte at one point from Wayne Green, and so Felix was the Brit who was trying to get into the American computer magazine market, and eventually one of my very best friends. But so as we were going with Jim Kobach and going to his house in Darien and being served hors d'oeuvre and wine by his wife on the patio while we were discussing business, it was quite the elegant way of doing magazine publishing. We also were talking to Better Homes and Gardens, and they actually had a focus group. They actually went so far as to have one of the biggest focus group companies in the country do a focus group on the idea. And literally the focus group was so positive that they felt they had to do it again because they didn't think the first one was real. And then the second one they did with a bunch of accountants during tax season, and it didn't go well.
What do you mean they did it with accountants?
Literally, they did it in March, and like half the people in the room were in one way or another tax accountant.
Oh, wow.
These are not people who are in the best of mood to be talking about leisure reading in March. And so it did not go well. It did not go anywhere near as well. And eventually the project got dropped. But also my champion within the Better Homes and Gardens organization also moved on. And so that was Bert Boersma. But we came very, very close to being, it was going to be Better Homes and Gardens, Metropolitan Home Living Technology. We were going to be the next iteration of that home lifestyle magazine. I mean, complete with recipes, and, we were going to strike the whole across the board. Now, I would say we could have evolved into something like today's Wired magazine too. That was an opening that we could have gone. It would have really depended on the parent organization that we were with. But within the Better Homes and Gardens, we would have gone that more home lifestyle kind of way. But we might have gone the more technology way of Wired if we had been in the IDG group or one of those. So we mailed the business plan around and around and around and around, and all the responses were very positive, but everybody thought we were ahead of our time. Universally, the response was, the world isn't ready for this. It makes sense, but the world isn't ready for this. Which makes me very sad today, because we were right. The things we were writing about, the lifestyle we were writing about, the future that we predicted has come to pass. And there's no reason why we probably would have expedited that coming to pass if there had been a strong voice or a stronger voice that we would have had within the publishing community to advocate for more home technology and more consumer technology, although so much of it has had to do with setting of standards and the availability of the internet and wide Wi-Fi. And I mean, there's so many things, Deus Ex Machina kind of things that have had come to pass to make it all possible. But still, we had it right. We got it right. And I'm still very proud of the fact that we got it right. Well, let's see.
I got to ask, did you actually end up creating any kind of mock-ups of the magazine or writing test articles for it?
We wrote test articles. We had like 10 tables of contents for articles that we thought could be really written. We had a logo. We had David. Oh, another David. Gosh, you get to know all these people by their first names, and then 40 years intervenes and you forget their last names. He was the designer of the Time magazine logo. I mean, he was a player. And he did a lot of their covers too. He did our logo for us, and then we ended up, of course, not using it. But we had articles like the video yearbook. And in fact, I'll never forget Jim Kovac, as he was, we're sitting back having cocktails, and he's sort of thumbing through our test tables of contents, and he got to there and he went, "Oh God, no." He just couldn't imagine how awful that would be if kids were given video cameras and did a video yearbook. He was definitely of a different generation. But that was the kind of article, we reached. It wasn't just Wi-Fi refrigerators. We were reaching into every aspect of life and how this technology was going to affect how we looked at the world. And I'm very, very proud of it. And we had a lot of writers ready to come on board too, because so many of the writers who had been writing for Softside were ready to come right on board and start writing for it. They bought into the vision, but we just couldn't get that nut of money. And the thing is, it was the kind of magazine that couldn't be started small. It was the kind of magazine that you couldn't do 5,000 copies and have enough advertising and that kind of thing to make it work. In order to work, it had to come out of the gate through some national national publishing company that could get major advertisers on board from day one and have a sample circulation of 35,000. That was the kind of project that we were looking at, and it was the only way that kind of lifestyle magazine, mainstream lifestyle magazine, could be done. So there was a certain level, certain nut we had to make in order to start it, and we just could never get quite to that point. But in the meantime, I met everybody. The people I didn't already know in the computer magazine publishing industry and the mainstream computer industry, I met in the process of making all these presentations. And they all thought I was a bright young man. They were all impressed as hell with the business plan. It wasn't that they had any question of our ability to make a magazine and pull off the business that we said we were going to have. Their problem was with the concept. So along the way, and as I said, that brought me to Felix Dennis. Well, Felix had tried to buy his way into the American magazine market by buying Byte. One of his partners, Peter, again, last name evades me, but he was a part owner of Adam and Eve sex toy company, and had some money. And then another partner, Bob, had made money. He actually at one point was head of the Columbia Record Club. Remember the old Columbia Record Club many, many years ago? Well, Bob ran that and had made money through that. So the three of them, and Felix had quite an empire of computer magazines and other mainstream magazines in England already. So the three of them together had quite a bit of money to pool and start projects. And they had tried to buy Byte. That hadn't worked. And he had teen magazines, Teen Beat magazines. He had those in the UK, and he brought some of those over here, and they were cheap to start. So he could, do one-offs of those. And then Peter, his partner, had actually broken into the George, gosh, I'm really good with first names today, aren't I? Star Wars George.
George Lucas.
George Lucas. He had actually broken into George Lucas's office and somehow gotten, or offices, I mean, not his personal office, but in the offices, and somehow gotten stills out of Star Wars before Star Wars came out, and was able to have ready to publish and put on the newsstands a 4-color Star Wars special that was completely made up of ripped off images the day after Star Wars played in the theaters.
Wow.
Peter's morals were always a little right on the edge. Right on the edge. I can't say the same for Bob or Felix, but Peter stretched the envelope a bit. But he also, when I ran for New Hampshire House of Representatives years later, he also gave me $7,000 towards my campaign, making me the best finance campaign in New Hampshire House history. So I can't complain. Anyway, so I met Felix with my associate publisher, made the presentation on living technology. He said, no, we're not going to do it. But I have all of these other potential magazine projects, and I like the way you think. I like the way you look at markets. I like the way you yada, yada, yada. And a mutual admiration society was born. And he hired me. Oh, gosh, over the years, I did. He had a weekly called Microscope in the UK that was like now my own history, because it was in the PC market. PC Week. It was like PC Week, but it was called Microscope in the UK. And he considered bringing it over to compete with PC Week. And I did the data analysis and the ad counts and the market analysis and all of that to basically come back to him and say you could make a little bit of money, but the competition would be so stiff that you really wouldn't make a lot of money, and I don't recommend it. And he decided not to do it.
Okay, now, just out of curiosity, at this point in time, we're talking what year approximately? 86, 87?
No, 80, because this was pre-Mac. So 82, 83, 81, 82, 83, somewhere in there.
Okay, so this would have still been while you were at Softside.
No, let's see. I left Softside. Let me get this right. You're making me think about calendars. Yeah, because I left Softside. Black Thursday was August 27th, 1983. That was the end of Softside.
Yeah.
At least for me. August 27th, 1983. This would have been 80. Maybe there was a Mac by then. 85?
Well, the Mac itself, I mean, you get the 84 launch. I'll put that in quotation marks. I don't think it's a wide launch,
which I was at with my team. I told you that story last time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But and understand, I was kind of covering about a 5-year period with Felix of various projects that I did over a 5-year period, including after Mac User started. The Microscope project was actually after my Mac User, as I think about it.
Okay. I was just trying to figure out if it was before or after, just to try to keep the...
No, I've forgotten what, in chronology, I've forgotten what project I did, because I did some project for him before Mac User, because there was something besides living technology for which I had his respect. Because then what happened, because here's the story of Mac User. Here's how Mac User got you have to kind of look through Mac World to get there. Mac World magazine came out with the Mac. It had Apple's blessing. They had inside information while the Mac was being developed so that their first issue could come out at the same time that the Mac came out. They were a special format size. They weren't the standard trim size of a magazine. They were oversized. They had special super calendared paper, which was this non-glossy but very high quality paper, non-reflective, very expensive look and feel to the magazine, and they charged an arm and a leg for it in terms of their subscriptions and their individual copies. As I remember, it was $4 a copy, which in those days was outrageous for a copy of a magazine. Beautifully done. I have every compliment to them in terms of graphic arts and graphic design and use of typography and that kind of thing. They did a beautiful job of designing the magazine, but it was also kind of an example of design run amok. It was a case where design had perhaps gotten a little too powerful and the information was not as featured as it could be. I'm a big one on making sure type is readable and big enough and in the right typeface and that kind of thing, that you're conveying information at the maximum, and graphic design comes secondary to that. But anyway, I digress. They also could never say a bad word about anything because of this inside baseball kind of arrangement that they had with Apple and with the other software publishers and that kind of thing. They loved everything. It was Pollyannaville. And so, and Felix and I, because Felix also had a Lisa, by the way, and so he and I over the over the months had commiserated over our leases and why there wasn't better coverage and why there wasn't better software because we loved our leases and yada, yada, yada. And then the Mac came along and we both had Macs and we both loved the Macs. And we had even said in passing that if we did another computer magazine, at this point, it would have to be a Mac magazine. It just made too much sense. It was too revolutionary. It was clearly the opening in the market. And so I'm in New Hampshire one night in my house in the woods, and my parents are visiting from Nebraska. We're having a very pleasant evening, and the phone rings at, I don't know, like 11 o'clock at night. And it's Felix. Not totally uncommon for him to call at 11 o'clock at night, but not common either. And so, hi, Felix, how are you? Well, mate, I just threw the latest copy of Macworld across the room into the bin. Okay, then. He said, we're going to do a Mac magazine. I'm so fed up. Well, it turns out they had done an article on the special paper that they were printed on.
Oh,
no. I mean, talk about getting inside baseball. This was an article on their paper. Just a little,
Jesus.
Self-served, self-focused. Anyway, and it had pissed him off. And so he threw the magazine across the room and literally picked up the phone and called me and said, we're going to do a Mac magazine. And he said, can you be in New York for lunch tomorrow? Okay. And at that point, at that time, there was an hourly shuttle plane running between New York and Boston. And so, it was like a bus. It was easy to drive to Boston, get on the plane, go to New York, take a cab to Felix's apartment, spend the day with Felix, and at 6 o'clock, take a cab back to LaGuardia, get on a plane, go back to Boston, pick up the car, and drive back and be back in my house in New Hampshire by 10 o'clock at night. And I did this regularly in terms of my consulting gigs in New York. Every once in a while, I would stay over, but it wasn't uncommon at all for me to do a day trip to New York like that. So anyway, I arrive at Felix's apartment, because this is top secret. Nobody within his organization is to know we're doing this. So we do this at Felix's apartment. And he called it the Burberry Project. I'm not quite sure why. I have no history as to why that particular word was chosen, but for weeks it was the Burberry Project, so that we could talk about it without talking. We built a minor spreadsheet, a pretty perfunctory spreadsheet that day. We put together, I think, about 3 issues worth of articles that we thought we would want to do, just outlines of the kinds of articles we would want to do. We put together, who would we want from who we knew in the industry to be columnists. Felix knew John Dvorak, so we got John Dvorak from day one, and who was kind of the anti-Mac columnist in the back of the book. But we had the contacts between the two of us. We knew who to call. And basically what we did was we put enough on paper or on disk to show to Felix's partners to get them to buy in, because the basic deal was we were going to have $3 million in capital, $1.5 million from each of the 2 business partners, and Felix was going to put in sweat equity and run the company. And that's what happened. And that set off a roller coaster. I did most of the staffing of the magazine. I did most of the interviewing and the staffing of, I hired Steve Bobker as the editor. I hired Steve Rosenfield as the advertising sales director. They both brought very good teams with them that they had worked with at other publications. Felix already had some real estate near Times Square in New York that he could convert. He had recently moved one of his teen magazines to other circumstances, and it was a little bit of a tight fit for a magazine of our size, but it was on like the 17th floor, about 2 blocks off of Times Square.
Wow, that's expensive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I remember one of the most stunning things was if you sat in Felix's office, it was like a double length office with glass along the side and all very classically furnished, tufted leather sofa and the whole 9 yards. And well, I'll tell you about Felix's art collection in a minute. But as you looked out that window, if you looked essentially straight up, you could see the spires of the Empire State Building.
Wow.
Or the spire. And so that was where we worked. Now I worked in a windowless office when I was there because I wasn't there daily. I worked in my office in New Hampshire the vast majority of the time, and then would come in and do 2 or 3 days here or there, or a day here or a day there. But they did give me my own office because I was there enough that I needed to have a place. And I'm sure they loaned it out to other people when I wasn't there. I tried to keep it clean enough that they could do that. Gosh, we just did everything from, and they didn't really know, or Felix's organization didn't really know how to do trade shows or how to do launches. His whole experience was UK on that front, and it's done very differently there. Everything's a little more twee, everything's a little more champagne and orange juice and formal and flowers than it is here. Now, mind you, we brought that here. One of the things that I did was to make a lot of his presence here to play up on his Britishness. That was kind of one of our calling cards, was that when you went to a Mac user event, it had kind of a British flair to it. Some of it was because he insisted on it, but a lot of it was because I was playing up the Britishness of Felix and our different voice, because that was one of the main things that we had to say, was that Mac user was different. Oh, I remember what happened. That's right. Not only because I flew to New York and we did the business plan, and then the first Macworld Expo was still that week. That was on like a Tuesday, and the Macworld Expo opened on Friday in San Francisco. So I flew back to New Hampshire. I packed my bags, flew out to San Francisco, was supposed to meet Felix, and we were going to hang out at Macworld Expo and try to do our research on, what software we're going to review, where was the industry going, that kind of thing. And he put me up at this really, really swanky hotel. Like a private valet kind of swanky hotel. And then he threw his back out and couldn't come. So I was left to do all of this on my own. And essentially what I did was I hung out on the edges of booths where I was kind of, not there, and listened to what users were saying. And I listened to their complaints, and there were lots of them. People were not happy with Macworld Magazine. They were not happy with Apple. They weren't happy. They wanted more access. They wanted a franker voice, basically, and instead of this Pollyanna, everything's honey and roses. And so I would go home and I would write note after note after note about the things that we should do and what I specifically had heard and that kind of thing. And we kind of became the anti-Mac world. That was the niche that Mac user fit into. Mac world was for Apple. Mac user was for the users.
Gotcha. Now, when you guys announced that you were coming out with this magazine, did you get any response from Apple itself about this?
I wasn't privy to a lot of that, to be honest with you. There was some. I know that was one of the assets that we had in bringing Steve Bobker in. Steve Bobker already had quite a good relationship with Apple. And we also, I'm trying to remember, he brought in a couple of technical editors. I'm trying to remember their names. They escape me at the moment. I think we were welcomed. I mean, every indication I got was that Apple was happy to see us out there playing. We didn't get the kind of insider support that Macworld got, but we didn't want it. That wouldn't fit with who we were. And we did get, when it came time to get machines and get preview equipment and that kind of thing, we got that. That was never a problem. We signed our non-disclosures, we did our due diligence, and we had no problem with access to Apple technology that every other member of the press. But Macworld, of course, got there first always. It's kind of funny, as I told you before we started, all of these players in the market were characters. And David Bennell, who was the publisher of Macworld magazine, was arrogant. The attitude that he carried around in the world very much showed through in the magazine. And if you got to know him, and later on, I consulted for Macworld. Long after Mac User was sold to Ziff Davis, I consulted for Macworld for about 6 months, helping them with events and that kind of thing. Writing press releases. the whole world was an adventure at that point. Things moved so quickly that you never knew. You'd be walking down the aisle at a trade show thinking that all was hunky-dory and you had everything set for your event that night, and your client would run up to you, and Apple had just made an announcement at a press conference that they were doing this technology, and oh my God, our product fits in it in this way, and we have to get a press release out in the next half hour that says, so suddenly I'm off in a hotel suite tapping away on a keyboard, putting out a press release. And that was what that lifestyle was like. So it's hard not to jump around. There's so many things that went on. But there was one thing from day one, and that was that we had our funding. There was never a question that we were going to do MacUser. Once we decided to go ahead, there was no soft ground to tread. We were on hard ground from day one, and we knew what we were going to do. And Felix asked me the next thing, and I did so many different things for MacUser that they had a hard time figuring out what they were going to put above my name on the masthead. And what we finally decided was we put a whole category called Research and Development and put Kotwitz and Associates, which was my consulting firm, under that. And that was, if you go to the MacUser issues, that's what you'll find. It says Research and Development, Kotwitz and Associates. And that was the easiest umbrella to put us under, because we did so many different things. So Felix had me handle the launch at Macworld Expo in Boston. The first Macworld Expo in Boston was our launch. And he had me handling that. And I went to him and said, so what are we going to do for a launch party? And he said, oh, mate, I have been to every kind of magazine launch in London you can think of, and they're all quite forgettable. You spend a lot of money on them, and they all look the same. And, I'm not sure we want to do more than just like a basic cocktail party or something, And this was not my idea of what we should be doing. I wanted to make a splash. Well, I looked at him and I said, Felix, put yourself in my hands and I will give you a launch event that you will never forget. Honestly, I have no idea what the hell I was talking about, but I'm faking it till you're making it. I don't know, but something inside of me said, you've got to do a big party and you can make this a big party. Well, I went to Boston, and I went to the aquarium, I went to the cyclorama, I went to the Institute of Fine Arts, I went to all the places, the Museum of Science, all the places that had already been used for big parties before. And either there was a capacity problem or they were already booked, and I just wasn't finding anything that wasn't going to be just another launch party that everybody would forget as soon as the champagne glasses were clean, And when I was at the aquarium, and the aquarium would have been very interesting, except it was too small. That was my capacity. And she said, well, have you considered a boat party? Well, no, hadn't thought about that. I'd been on a whale watching boat. I'd been on the ferry over to P-Town several times, but I had not considered a boat party. Well, I went, and as it turns out, the aquarium was literally like a block from where the boat office was. So I went over, I talked to the boat people, and literally the only boat available to us was a whale watching boat. This was before there was a Spirit of Boston or a Spirit of San, the fancy dinner boats that have the kitchen on board, and did not exist. We were dealing with a whale watching boat. And now they had done weddings and big parties on it, and they knew how to do it, but it was a dog standing on its hind legs. I literally, well, I'll get there, but eventually there was a boat party. I had 23 different vendors who had to access that boat within the 3-hour period to make that boat party happen, from audio equipment to the special napkins that Felix wanted, to caterers, to furniture, to you name it, balloons, flowers, blah, 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 blah. But it was the right thing. It was the right thing. And I took it to Felix and I said, how about after a hot day in Boston in August, we take them all out and we serve them dinner on a boat in Boston Harbor? He liked the idea. And so I rented a boat. And the thing that I've always said for years is if the boat had sank in that harbor that night, there would be no more Mac industry, because anybody who was anybody in the Mac industry, with the exception of Steve Jobs, we did not have Steve Jobs on board, but other than Steve, we had every luminary you can imagine on board that boat, and those 250 people that had dinner with us that night. And it was the ticket to have at Macworld Expo. Everybody wanted to come to the Mac user boat party. Well, I had pulled a few tricks. This is where I made my reputation as an event man. Because the other thing that Felix was so concerned about was that usually at these things, the bigwigs at the companies often give their tickets to these parties away. And he wanted to make sure that the bigwigs came to the party. Because we were going to be talking about advertising. That was, in the end, you will build relationships at these parties and then you make the calls afterwards to sell them advertising. And so he wanted to make sure that the bigwigs were coming. Well, so what I did was I said that we would provide transportation from their hotel to the party. And so when they called to RSVP, I would ask them what hotel they were staying at. So then that was at the time that, and I think they still have double-decker buses in Boston. We rented double-decker buses, again, playing up on the whole London English connection. So we had double-decker buses that were picking them up. And I had this list of who was staying at what hotel. And the day before the show opened, my partner and I went out and we had bottles of champagne and we had printed up tags that went around the the neck of the bottle that said, "See you at the party on Tuesday," or whatever it was, Thursday. I can't remember what day of the week it was. And then a folder that said, "Welcome to Boston," that had in it every guidebook I could get for free from the Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau. So it looked like a really expensive packet, but it was all free. And a copy of the magazine, a copy of the brand new magazine that nobody had seen. So they saw the magazine for the first time in their hotel room before they went to the show. They never had to carry one back. Everybody that we wanted to influence saw the magazine. They got a bottle of champagne, and sure enough, they showed up for the party. And I mean, we had everybody. We had Jean-Louis Gasset. We had Phil... and I can't remember Phil's name. He invented the camera phone eventually from Broderbund. Gosh, I can't think of his last name. Anyway, we had everybody on that boat, and it was a wonderful night. It had been hot and sweaty and icky on the floors. I remember even the air conditioning had failed in the hall, and it was just awful. And I will never forget the feeling that swept over the crowd when we pulled away from the dock, and that cool breeze from the harbor swept over the boat, and everybody was in heaven. And party cost about $50,000, as I remember. I remember paying the bar tab with my platinum card that night, and it was something over $8,000. Yeah. It was a night. It was a night. And I was very, very proud of what we produced, and Felix was very happy. Oh, and the other thing that we pulled off was we had a photographer, so that as everybody boarded the boat, they would stop on the gangway, and we had the life preserver from the boat and a copy of the magazine cover inside of it on the front of the gangway, and we took a picture of everybody as they got on the boat, and those were all processed, and we had them ready to give back to them in frames when they came back from the party. So they all went home with pictures of themselves from the party with our magazine cover on it. So all during the next year, Macworld advertising reps were going into their offices and looking at pictures of them with our magazine cover.
I gotta ask, you're doing this at the Macworld Expo, a show put on, organized by the Macworld magazine. How awkward was that?
Awkward. I won't say it wasn't. Walking by their booth, there were definite looks. I was pretty much an unknown quantity at the time as far as the whole marketing side of things were concerned. So we did blindside them. We really did blindside them. They were not expecting the kind of sweep that we did marketing-wise, and they were not happy about it. The other thing we did one of my tricks that I did at the trade show, Felix wanted to do bags. He wanted to do shopping bags. And by that time, I had enough experience through the trade shows that I'd done with Softside that I'd learned a few things. And one of the things that I'd learned was, and I'd been to the Consumer Electronics Show where the bag competition is like the biggest in the world. People literally give away like $10 bags. And the thing that I had learned was you had to be the biggest, the strongest, and the most comfortable to carry bag at the show, or you may as well not compete, because your bag was going to swallow everybody else's bag. And I said this to Felix, and I said, they're going to be expensive, mate. You're just going to have to pay for them. They're going to be like $1.50 a piece. But they're going to have nice soft cord handles, reinforced handles. You know, they're going to be big. We'll have your logo all over them. And he didn't believe me. He went along with me, just as if he went along with me with a bunch of things that he didn't believe me on. But he went along with me, and we got these great big bags that said Mac user, Mac user, Mac user over them. I'm sure people are probably still storing things in them because they were heavy plastic. I will never forget one of my funniest Felix stories was at one of the shows. Oh, and the other thing was we pre-packed the magazine in the bag, so that as you gave the bag to people, and I would hire models, and they would walk the periphery of the booth, and we would hold our bag open for people to put their other bags in and hand it back to them with a copy of our magazine already in the bag.
Nice.
Well, and it worked. It worked at every show. In fact, it eventually worked for Windows User Magazine at a Comdex show so well that I had all the Comdex people at the back of the hall pointing at my booth going, what the hell is he doing? Because I did the same thing. It was, you know, this is not rocket science. Once you got the concept down, you got the concept down. But anyway, so during one of the Macworld shows, I did catch Felix, because Felix worked the line. He always... He would help put magazines out. He would help hand out bags. He was not in any way superior to any of his workers. He would work the line at the booth. And I caught him opening a bag for somebody and say, yep, I always said you got to have the biggest bag at the show. It's got to have the most comfortable hand. He was quoting me. And I was like 30 feet away, and I looked at him, and I just kept looking at him till he caught my eye. And he said, well, I always say it now. So we took the market by storm. You know, there's no doubt that Mac User Magazine took the market by storm, and we were a very, very hard competitor to Macworld. Made lots of money, got lots of attention, and we were the first to do an industry-wide award. Macworld eventually did one. I can't remember what they called theirs, but we did what was eventually called the Eddie Award. And the Eddie Award was sculpted by an artist friend of Felix's, and I actually carried the clay sculpture on the plane from Boston, or from New York to Boston, and then to the smelter in somewhere in Rhode Island, I think, to actually make the statue. And they actually gave me an honorary one because I arranged the original dinner. We did the dinner at the Four Seasons Clift Hotel in San Francisco at a Macworld Expo there. Again, with all the cognoscenti, we had, now that was when Jobs had been pushed out. That was during the Scully days. And we had Jean-Louis Gasset as our, the guy who they shook the hands and had their picture taken with, so that they had a picture. And so they gave me an honorary award that night. That night has so many stories to tell because Felix got very, very drunk. They had decided to sell the magazine. Ziff Davis had come to them and offered them, I think it was $9.5–10 million for the magazine, when they were literally into it for $3 million cash and a year and a half of sweat equity. Not
a bad ROR.
No, not bad at all. Not bad at all. But Felix did not want to sell. Felix was having a ball. This was a magazine. Felix was a magazine publisher at his heart and soul. He loved magazine publishing. He loved the game. He loved everything from what they call Billy calls, where you'd call a competitive magazine and try to get their media kit and find out the advertising pitch they were doing so that you could counter it through, you name it. He loved the entire game of magazine advertising, or magazine, not just advertising, but the whole magazine publishing. And so he did not want to sell the magazine when his partners insisted on it. Yes, it was a good ROI, no doubt about that. And so he got very drunk that night, and he was my co-master of ceremonies for the event. And this was, I've learned a lot of things about awards over the years. There is a reason why the Academy Awards are not engraved when they give them to the people, because trying to keep those damn statuettes organized in such a way that you give the right statuette to the right person is nearly impossible. And I know that seems like a small organizational thing, but oh my God, what you go through. So I had them all, and ours were all pre-engraved, and I had them set up on 2 tables on 2 sides, the ones that Felix was giving away, the ones that I was giving away. They were in the right order. As long as you took from the front, you'd be fine, yada, yada, yada. And there is this wonderful picture that exists of Felix. Well, first of all, what had happened was he decided that we were going to start the awards ceremony before people were done eating. No, we were not going to do but he was drunk, and so I had to, I was one of the few people who could actually stand up to Felix. Most people kowtowed in front of him, and when Felix said jump, they said how high. Mm-hmm. I said, Felix, no, here's what we're actually going to do. And there's this wonderful picture where he's signaling to the waiters that we're about to start the awards ceremony, and I'm behind him, and I was about a head taller than Felix, and I've got my arm out. And you can tell that I'm actually directing over his head what we're really going to do. So that they were crazy, crazy times. And we had such a good time. We had such, because also the Mac was such a miracle computer for its time. The whole graphic user interface and a whole new suite of software and a whole new way of looking at the world. And then I think it was the next Macworld Expo, they had started a new hints and tips column in the magazine, which they called the Power Users Manual. There was no book. There literally was no book called the Power Users Manual, but they made a mock-up of a book called the Power Users Manual and put it on the cover of the magazine. And this happened to be the magazine that we were giving away at the trade show.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. So I'm out there because I worked the front lines too. I never hung back. I would, and I'm hearing over and over again, where can I buy the book? Where can I buy the book? Where can I buy the book? Well, there's no book. It's just a column in the magazine. It's going to be a regular column. You'll get hints and tips every month. It's a cool thing, yada, 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 but there is no book. So on like the 3rd day of the show, after hearing this over and over and over and over again, I go to Felix and I said, you really ought to publish this damn book. And he said, well, would you like to write it? Because, of course, I was by this time working on a Mac. I was doing nothing but everything on a Mac. And thus was born my book, The Power Users Manual.
Oh, okay.
And I proceeded for the next approximately 6 months to take every hint and tip that I knew and write it up. And I subscribed or somehow got copies of every newsletter from every Mac user group I could find in the whole damn country, from Berkeley to Boston. And I didn't I didn't actually type in their hints and tips. I tested everything that they said and I rewrote it. But that's where my 1,068 hints and tips for the Macintosh came from, was from all those newsletters. And perhaps as revolutionary as the book itself was how I published it, because the hints and tips needed to be organized in such a way that they were under the individual application. And it became what we now know as database publishing did not exist at the time. But it became apparent to me very quickly, especially with the typesetting capabilities of now with the Mac, of using Microsoft File, I think was what I wrote it in. Yeah, oh, Microsoft wow. File. How's that for a dead program? But with the being able to do fancy fonts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and being able to, because I had PageMaker, I could write all these hints and tips within the database manager, sort them however I wanted at any time, output, headline and body, whatever data I wanted from that data record, and yet have other data records that would make them more manipulable for writing the book for whatever. So I did some of the very first database publishing in those hints and tips, and then used PageMaker 1.0 to lay out a 186-page book.
Oh, geez.
Yes, at a time when the head of Aldus was saying that anybody that was doing more than a 16-page document in PageMaker was out of their minds. Because you could only do a 16-page document. Everything. So everything had to, so there was cut and paste of text from the end because you make columns fit, and it was definitely a dog standing on its hind legs, no doubt about it. But I did it. And the other thing that I did, and this was really funny, behind every app, the name of every application, like Microsoft File or Microsoft Word or whatever, we had the icon for that application. Well, we had all of this stuff typeset on a Mergenthaler, is that right? Is that the name of the typesetting?
Yeah, you got me on that one.
Anyway, they were the first ones to offer typesetting for Macintosh. So that, this was the step above the laser printer. Suddenly you went from 300 dots an inch to 1,200 dots an inch on the typesetter, or 12,000 dots an inch, whatever it was. And we had the whole thing typeset, but the icons typeset too clearly. The little squares that made up the icons made them so blocky that they were ugly as sin. And so we created strips of type. We went through it, and the pages came out as full pages. And then my art department at the magazine in New York printed out the whole book again and took an X-Acto knife and cut out every little icon and pasted it in over the typeset icon to have a laser icon that was prettier.
Oh, wow.
So, it was crazy. But that book, I have had probably at least half a dozen people tell me that they ran their consulting companies based on that book for several years.
Wow.
And you see what MacUser did, rather than selling it, they used it as a subscription premium, so that if you renewed or if you got a new subscription, you got a free copy of the book. The result was that it was the most widely distributed book for the Macintosh for about 2 years. And what today is known as the Macintosh Bible is what evolved out of the Power Users Manual. I still, every once in a while, am asked to autograph a copy by some old Mac head who remembers that it saved their life over and over again. And it was. I mean, those hints and tips, if they were invaluable at a time that, there were all these hidden Easter eggs and control key combinations and that kind of thing that would get the software to do things that it wouldn't otherwise. So those hints and tips were very valuable. But it's still a feather in my cap that I did the Power Users Manual. And it was the first technical use of the Power User name, too. We actually ended up copyrighting and trademarking the Power User name from it.
Gotcha.
So we went on from there, but he sold the magazine. Ziff was interested. I guess my last experience with MacUser was in the last 3 months before they sold it. Felix was going on to start a new project in England, and he brought me into New York and had me basically take over the magazine for about a 6-week period. And what was unforgettable about it was that I walked into his office and it looked like a Post-it factory had exploded in there. He had basically taken every piece of paper on his desk and written a Post-it on it as to what to do with it or what he was about to do with it or a description of it or whatever. And then he had spread it out on every flat surface, every chair, every couch, every table, every windowsill, every bit of the floor. The whole place was covered. If somebody had opened the window, it would have been a disaster.
Oh, geez.
And I went in, I took one look around, and I went back out to his secretary and I said, Susan, I will be in my office for the next 2 days. I am not to be disturbed. And that is what I did. For 2 days, I one at a time took all these pieces of paper, and it was the perfect thing because he couldn't cross over with me. I've forgotten what the thing was, but for some reason he had to leave the office before I showed up at the office. So there was no crossover time. in terms of my taking over the running of the company. And so this was the only way. And it ended up working. It worked very, very well because I had a snapshot of everything that was going on. And I took over the company and ran it for about 3 months.
Cool.
And that was just before it was sold. And Ziff was interested in me as a publisher, but I wasn't interested in them. They were too corporate. They were just way too corporate, and the environment, the Ziff Davis publishing environment was not one in which artistic people thrived. And and I did continue to work for them. That's right. I quit rather dramatically because we did the boat party, by the way, for 3 years. The boat party, after we did it once, we did it 3 more. And by the time I was done, there was a Spirit of Boston, and we were doing it on the Spirit of Boston. And then the next year that we were to do it again, and it was still the ticket. It was the e-ticket of Macworld, and everybody wanted it. And so the 4th year when we were going to do it, this was after the magazine was sold to Ziff Davis. Marty Masner, who was the new publisher, decided that he didn't want to do it. He wanted to do something new. And what he wanted to do was a tent there on the grounds of the show at Macworld in South Boston, because he wanted to be able to sell advertising at the event. It was too important to him. He didn't understand that the event was about building relationships and that the advertising got sold afterwards. That was the concept that he just didn't buy. And so as a result, he wanted an environment where they could do high pressure sales at the show floor there in South Boston. Well, you can't air condition a tent. Well, you can, but it's not practical. It was very, very hot. The joke during, and I resigned over it. I said, no, my reputation is based on this, and I simply I will not do that. And so they went ahead and did it anyway. And the joke during the first day of the show was, do you want to go out to the Mac user tent and have a glass of brie? Because it was so hot that it was melting all the cheese.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
So I want to go back just a little bit here. So you're setting up a Mac user. Now, obviously, this is, I'm going to guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a very different scale from the operations of SoftSide.
Oh, completely.
So what were some of the challenges you had adjusting to, I guess, probably new distribution channels, or at least different scale of distribution, manufacturing of goods, and so forth?
Luckily, I did not have to deal with that. And the reason I didn't have to deal with that was because the partnership, Bob, Peter, and Felix, had a print buyer who bought all the Adam and Eve catalogs, who bought all of the Teen Beat magazines, he bought all of their projects, bought all of the Star Wars one-offs. So he was a print buying specialist, and that was all he did for a living, was buy our printing. And as far as distribution was concerned, they already had their relationships with the major distributors, and they knew how to handle the payola and the glad handing and all the shit that needed to be done to make that system work. So
how bad was the payola back then?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. There are those who will say that most of it was just giving away free tickets to baseball games and that kind of thing. There are those who will say that it'll level up real cash. There is no doubt that the magazine distribution game in this country was mob controlled for most of its life. And so with the combination of not only the mob control at the higher level, but the kind of environment that you can imagine that built at the lower level amongst the drivers and the Teamsters and that kind of thing, it was a pretty rough environment. It was a pretty rough environment. But it was one that, once we got to that scale, there were the professionals who dealt with that environment. I just farmed that out.
Gotcha. And
so I have to deal with that on a face-to-face basis.
And how were the sales distributed? I mean, I'm picturing it in my head because I knew it from other computer magazines at the time. You still saw computer magazines at, your drugstores and your supermarkets, but you also started to see them more and more pop up at specialty stores, computer shops, and the like. And of course, there's always subscription. How did the retail environment? How did that break down for you guys?
Very, very little through the specialty market. Because, once you cracked the nut of being in the mainstream, once you were doing the drugstores, the supermarkets, that kind of thing, the numbers for the specialty stores were so minor that unless you were doing, now for the book, they did sell the book because they needed to establish its price point. So they did sell the book in some computer stores. But as I remember, it was kind of hard to come across a copy of Mac User in a computer unless they were in the mainstream magazine distribution market. And that it really depends on the area of the country that you're in. If there are some areas, more populated areas of the country where Joe Blow computer store actually will be serviced by a mainstream computer or a mainstream magazine distributor because they happen to be where it's convenient on a route. So it's an easy stop. Whereas Joe Blow computer store in Hastings, Nebraska, that requires everything being mailed to them, and that's a whole different matter. And so you don't want to carry that kind of account because the overhead is just too high.
Gotcha.
But Mac User's primary distribution was subscription.
Okay.
That was, and they were the experts at that. Bob did the Columbia Record Club.
True. Yeah, that the ultimate subscription.
Well, and we had the Power Users Manual to give away. I mean, that was the other thing. This was a must-have book. People had to have this book, and they could get it for free. And actually, I don't know how good your memory is, but Smithsonian Magazine used to do a promotion where you got an envelope in the mail and it had a code printed on the back on the return address. And to get a discount, you had to transfer that code onto the postcard that you returned and you would get a special gift. Well, that was the whole thing, was there was a code on the outside of the envelope that if you transcribed that code, you would get the Power Users Manual. So the whole thing looked very, very much like that Smithsonian promotion, which had won all sorts of awards and was hugely successful. And, yada, yada, yada. And we just did it again.
Very cool.
So, yeah, that whole Mac User experience was a wild ride.
I'll believe it.
And knowing Felix is his own wild ride. Felix is gone now, regrettably. But Felix was a very sexual being. I told you Maxim Magazine was his final project, or his biggest final project. Only dated Asian women, told dirty jokes like crazy. Was Eric Clapton's roommate at one point, played with the Yardbirds before they were the Yardbirds.
Oh, really?
And his real claim to fame was the Oz Trials. He and two of his mates published a magazine called Oz during the 60s that was full of alternative cartoons and that kind of thing. And I've forgotten exactly what it was that got them into trouble, but they got into trouble. And they ended up being so famous in terms of the obscenity trials, because it was obscenity, that even John Lennon showed up to protest in front of the Old Bailey when they were on trial.
Wow.
And in fact, if you would go into Felix's office on Goodge Street in London in the old days, he had a David Hockney drawing above his office desk that was the three Oz defendants all naked. So you'd be sitting there talking to Felix with his willy hanging out over his head. So the whole process of dealing with Felix and knowing Felix and riding with Felix, and he loved his money. I mean, he had made a fortune many, many times over, and he lived his money. He had a roller and a driver in England. He called me up one night. He also had a home in Connecticut and a flat in New York. He called me up one night and he said, "You won't believe what I bought today, mate." I said, "I have no idea, Felix," because, you just never knew with him. And this was another one of those 11 o'clock at night, and he was clearly drunk. And I said, "I have no idea, Felix. What did you buy?" He said, "I bought a helicopter." "Okay. To get me back and forth from New York to Connecticut." "Okay, fine. Guess what else I bought?" "I have no idea, Felix. A pilot, what do you need with a helicopter?" "I bought a backup." He'd bought two helicopters.
The definition of too much money.
Exact. This is the reason I can never return to London, because I have lived in London on his expense account.
Oh.
You know, I've gone to the most exclusive drinking clubs, these most exclusive restaurants, been driven around by a chauffeur in a roller, been taken to the country for luncheon on Tiffany Silver. You know, it was a lifestyle that no one could match. And Felix would always let me stay. He has 3 flats or had 3 flats in London. And he would always just let me stay at one of his flats in London while I was there, complete with the servants and the fresh flowers and all of that every day. So there is just no way that I can return to London. I wouldn't know how to live. I wouldn't know, you know. So that was one of the advantages to knowing Felix, was you got to live his lifestyle too. And there are many, many more stories. I could tell you another hour and a half worth of stories, you know, from restaurants that we were sitting in when he got the bill and he said, well, welcome to my new restaurant. I just bought the place. Or the time we got into the fight over who made the best white wine and I won. Or the time the Americans didn't know geography and I pointed out Latvia, Lithuania, and now I'm going to screw up. The 3 Balkans, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Yeah. And he was just shocked that I knew my geography well enough that I knew the Balkans. You know, there was just story after story after story with Felix. And it was an adventure. I loved the man dearly. Now, I will tell you, he was a horrible, horrible misogynist. He did not personally respect women at all. That said, he gave them management positions in his companies, respected them professionally, but personally, his relationships were just awful. The way he treated his girlfriends and the multiple girlfriends that he had at any given time. Literally was so known for his multiple girlfriends that 60 Minutes gathered all of them around a table once for an interview.
No way, really? Okay, that's got to be up on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. If you go back, you'll find stuff about Felix. 60 Minutes did 2 different pieces on him, and I'm sure they're on YouTube. I haven't looked for them, but I'm sure they're there. But at the same time, erudite, well-read, built at his estate in Stratford-on-Avon. He built this parade, and if you find the YouTube thing, you'll see it, this avenue of great people that was everybody from Stephen Hawking to Oscar Wilde and all sculptures that he commissioned. You know, so he was a conundrum. I think that's the best way to describe him. And in his latter years became a poet and published several volumes of poetry. And in fact, he had a tour of England called And Thanks for the Free Wine. And he literally raided his cellar for bottles worth hundreds of dollars and would serve it for free to entice people to come to his poetry reading.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, amazing.
He was one of the major players behind The Week. Are you familiar with The Week magazine?
No.
It's basically a digest of news magazines.
Oh, okay.
It first existed in London, and that was where he bought into it. And now there's a U.S. version and a very active online website. You'll often see quotes from The Week. Okay. And what they actually do is just digest everybody else's. And it's very well done. When you were Felix's friend, about once every 3 months, you got this big fat package in the mail that had sample issues of all of his new magazines and the books that he had helped publish and the articles about him that had been published. And it was a Felix care package. And every year at his estate in Stratford, he did a fireworks show for all of his employees. He would bust them all up there. And he would do a custom fireworks show that was programmed to music, and he would video the whole thing and then give out the videos at Christmas time as gifts. He knew David Bowie. He bought David Bowie's island in the Mediterranean and then gave I'm trying to remember the name, not Martinique. Trying to remember the name of the island, but put a blues festival there on the island that David Bowie came back to, and he would put out an annual DVD of that blues festival, breaking every copyright rule in the book, of course. Mystique. Mystique was his island.
Okay.
So it just wild lifestyle, wild lifestyle. But at the same time, a really great guy and one of the things he says in one of the 60 Minutes profiles is that he had to spend a great deal of his time convincing his friends without money to accept his help. And I have to say that there came a point in my life because he helped me a couple of times, but I have to say there came a point in my life where I just felt like I wasn't worthy of his friendship anymore. I'd moved on to other things, he'd moved on to other things, and it just didn't seem right anymore. And I'm really sorry I let that happen, and it's my fault. There's no doubt it's my fault. I could have been close to Felix until he died, and for some reason I let that friendship drift away.
I'm sorry to hear that.
But it happens. It happens. Well, we did have a falling out. But it's a falling out that we could have healed. It's a falling. Windows User Magazine was a disaster. He made the mistake of bringing in a guy who was far more interested in being a publisher than he was in the thing he was publishing. And as a result, he hired staff members who were far more interested in being an art director, an ad salesperson, or whatever, instead, and holding the title and the prestige instead of doing the work. And so I found myself and I was an outside consultant to the magazine doing their trade shows and their parties and stuff. And it was just an uphill battle all the way because nobody wanted to do the work. And as a result, they didn't make the sales. They didn't sell enough advertising. They didn't sell enough subscriptions. They didn't, and I was running my tail off trying to do everything I could do, and it wasn't enough. And so they ended up closing down the magazine quite suddenly, leaving all their bills unpaid, including mine. And they owed me about $10,000 at the time. And so I ended up suffering pretty greatly over that. And Felix didn't fix it. And I held a grudge for a while.
Oh, that's too bad.
So, but these things happen. It's the world of business.
Yeah. Now, and I do have to go back to Mac User for just one more sec. Because obviously you guys were having a good time making the magazine, it sounds like, even though I'm sure it was a ton of work.
Okay.
What was the interaction between the editorial staff and the readership like? I mean, obviously you've got shows going on and so forth and events, but was there, how deep was that engagement?
Well, certainly not the way it was at Softside. Certainly nothing like that. But, the readers loved MacU. The people who were desperate for a break from Macworld were very happy to find MacU. And so the readers that we would encounter at the trade shows were indeed quite enthusiastic and quite big supporters. Letters to the Editor was a fairly large section of the magazine, and I know Steve Bobker did a lot of work answering those letters and making sure that was a quality. You may be surprised to know that Letters to the Editor are often the most read section of any magazine or newspaper.
Really?
Yep. If you do readership research, you'll find that Letters to the Editor have a very, very high readership. And I know Steve Bobka, the editor, put a lot of work into making sure that our Letters to the Editor section was very good. I had and still have a lot of respect for Steve Bobker. I don't know what he's doing these days. Every once in a while, he'll pop up on Facebook or something, and I'll say hello, but we really don't have a relationship anymore. He's a good guy. He's a very smart and a very good guy. And loves sushi.
Okay, cool. Now, so you did mention a Windows User. Beyond writing some articles for it, did you have any other involvement with that project?
I didn't write any articles for it. I did the same thing that I did for Mac User in terms of doing their trade shows and their award show. We did an award show with Charlie Fleischer, the voice of Roger Rabbit.
Oh, cool.
And of course there we were doing more mainstream shows. It wasn't just the Mac specific shows. We were doing Comdex, which was a lot more expensive too. By the time you buy a booth at Comdex and staff it for 7 days, you've got one hell of an expense. And we did it right. I used basically the same vendors I'd used for Mac User, and we did bags that looked like them. And in fact, I told you about the Comdex experience in Atlanta, because we came in so late that our booth was way at the back of the hall. We were way, way, way back at the Congress Center. And yet, if you stood at the front door of Comdex, about every other person coming out the door was carrying a Windows user bag, and it looked like it was a Windows user show because we had won the bag wars. And literally, like on the second or third day of the show, I remember seeing several of the managers of the show standing off, a booth or two, but pointing and talking and indicating our booth, and they were trying to figure out how we were dominating the show from this space way in the back of the hall. And it was the bags. It was the simple bags. And we went through almost a full semi-trailer load of bags and magazines during that show. Literally, we had a semi-trailer to deliver them. And it sat out in the parking lot, and I had hourly deliveries of magazines and bags to the booth. And we had a room built into the booth. We had a 20 by 30 foot booth, and we had a 10 by 10 foot room built into the booth where there were two people who were doing nothing but stuffing magazines and bags the whole time and bringing whole armloads of bags out and handing them to the models so that they could hand them out. It was a factory. But that wasn't good enough. The thing is, no matter, you can only paint a turd purple so long. And
Wonderful
we had,
phrase.
yeah, and I thought we'd done a good job marketing. We had a good logo, we had a good concept, but they didn't create a magazine that lived up to it.
Too bad.
And if you don't do that, well, then you lose your readership. And again, it was all a matter of staff that was far more concerned about holding their titles and having the prestige and the expense account and everything else that went with it than they were about doing the work of the magazine. You have to love magazine publishing. Magazine publishing is very, very hard work. And if you're going to do it right, you have to love it, because you have to put in hours and physical labor and mental labor. And I've worked in many, many industries, and the only thing like it is theater. The only other place where I've seen that kind of intense investment that you have to make in order to make the product work is theater. Because you have to be multidisciplinary. You have to work in so many different areas. I'll never forget way back at Softside when I brought the woman I was interviewing to be my associate publisher. I brought her in from Denver. She was somebody I'd worked with in the theater, actually. And I wanted her to be my associate publisher, even though she had no publishing experience, because we had the relationship I needed. And I walked her through the company there in Milford, New Hampshire. And what she couldn't believe was how my language changed from department to department, from software development to the art department to the circulation department to, whatever. There was a different language that was spoken in each one of those fields, and in order to be a magazine publisher, I needed to speak each and every one of those languages individually, including computer, because of it being a computer magazine.
Makes sense, yeah.
So you have to. Magazine publishing is literally it and the theater are my two great loves in life. And it really is because of the intensity, and they have very similar things. There's a deadline that you must meet in each one. When your print deadline is coming, it's not like your printer can print you tomorrow if they didn't print you today. They have their time scheduled on the press, and you hit that time or you don't get printed. And so there is a drop dead date that you must be ready for. Your opening night is your drop dead date. And so there are similarities between the two fields that are so dramatic that you really can run one on the other's model.
Gotcha.
So my training in the theater was invaluable in magazine publishing. That multidisciplinary, turn on a dime, multi-creative collaboration. I think that's probably the biggest word in both magazines and theater is collaboration. Because that's the way you create something that is greater than the sum of its parts, is through collaboration.
Makes perfect sense. So after the sale to Ziff Davis, did you have any more adventures in computer magazine publishing?
I went on to work for Macworld. I consulted for Macworld for 6 months. Well, because they'd hired Steve Rosenfield, who had been the advertising director for Mac User. So they hired him, and he took me with him. And
Okay.
but it was not a good fit. It was not a good fit. I did a couple of breakfast events for them at trade shows and that kind of thing, and that was fine. But there wasn't room for me. There were people that did what I did for Macworld already, and they were very jealous of me. So even when I was handed a crumb of a breakfast meeting or something, whatever, they got very jealous. And they knew what I'd done for MacUser. I mean, the MacUser boat parties were famous. You know, that was the ticket to have at Macworld for years. And so when people heard that I had done the MacUser boat parties, that was that.
Gotcha. And I got to ask, did you ever actually invite anybody from Macworld to the boat parties?
No,
Okay.
no, that would have been inappropriate.
Okay. Yeah.
In the same way they didn't invite us to their parties.
Okay. Makes sense.
That was, and in fact, there was one kind of funny incident after Steve Rosenfield had gone over to Ziff and I was consulting with Ziff. We did, that's right, we did do one hell of a party. I'd forgotten about this. We did one in the private suite on the top of the Disneyland Hotel, complete with the private elevator that goes up the outside with the lights and all of that. And the baby grand piano on the turntable in the middle of the apartment and all of that. In fact, the Princess of Brunei had stayed in the suite the night before we had it for our party. And it was a Macworld advertising sales party. And just a standard cocktail party. And I can't say that there was anything special about the party. It was one of those very forgettable things other than where it was. And that was the thing. Everybody wanted to see this suite on the top of the Disneyland Hotel. And it was breathtaking. There's no doubt it was breathtaking. And I got to stay in it for the night, which was very cool as well. But that night, MacUser was having another party. And actually, that was, as I remember, that was for a MacUser show, now that I think about it. MacUser was having some sort of trade show there at Disneyland. I'm a little foggy on that. But I remember that there was an event that we had to go to, and it was open. It was an open invitation. It wasn't a RSVP'd invitation. And so Steve and I went to this MacUser event. I remember there was a big MacUser logo in ice sculpture in the middle of it that was melting and didn't look very good. And it's funny how things stick in your head, you know. And he got kicked out. The publisher of MacUser decided he didn't want a Macworld person there. He said, I was welcome because I worked throughout the industry. Even though I was a trader and working for Macworld, I was working for other people too. So I was welcome to stay, but they kicked Steve Rosenfield out because he was Macworld.
Oh, wow.
But that was a crazy time. That was a crazy. Oh, and then actually, just a little side story. It's a fairly big side story, but what the MacUser people did with their money from the sale of MacUser was they started Mac Warehouse. Are you familiar with Mac Warehouse and Micro Warehouse?
No.
They are still like the biggest software and hardware mail order companies in the country.
Oh, really?
And I named them. At a Christmas party. They came to me and told me they were going to do this mail order company and, combine their expertise of the three of them. And they wanted to know what they were going to call it because they just weren't sure. And the main thing that they were going to be was discount. That was the biggest thing, was they were going to be discount. And so I said, well, when people think about discount, they think about a warehouse. So how about Mac Warehouse? And Mac Warehouse was born. And also a thing that mail order isn't as big as it used to be in terms of catalogs. But for years in catalogs, you'd see a woman, or usually a woman, on a phone down in the corner of the cover of the magazine. Hi, I'm Rachel Coleman. That's my concept. I'm the one that originated that for Mac Warehouse, and it ended up getting picked up throughout the industry. But putting that on the cover of the magazine and doing that, I'm Rachel, call me, or whatever, is my concept.
Very cool.
So I wish I could tell you that I had the financial rewards of all of these things that I made up.
Probably.
But no, and again, it was because I was far more concerned with doing the work than I was for getting paid for it. If I had been more selfish, there are probably things I would have insisted on. Like, one of the things that Felix never gave away was pieces of his company. And I think if I had held my ground, I probably could have gotten a piece. And, there are a number of things over the years that I probably could have done that would have led to a greater financial reward for myself. But I was always so concerned about the work and the quality of the work.
Hmm.
That was what drove me.
Gotcha. And so after that stint with Macworld, did you dedicate yourself primarily to event planning in general, or how did that go?
Oh my! How many more hours do you have? You're going to sleep over there, so I can see.
Yeah, sorry. It's
No,
already,
I understand.
It's almost 1 a.m.
Well, let's do just a nickel version of the things I did. The next thing that I did after that, well, I worked for a number of different Mac companies, like monitor companies and that kind of thing, doing their PR. I worked for a security company called Kent Marsh Limited, and did a famous campaign, or famous within the Mac industry, called "Are You Still Naked?" That was about their encryption software, and made up a shirt that everybody in the industry had to wear. I'm big on shirts. One way or another, everything I do ends up ending up on a shirt that people want to wear. So worked in the Mac industry for a while, and then was putting together, believe it or not, a cat mail order company, a cat accessory, high-end kind of. It was going to be called Cats Alive, and I was going to move back to Nebraska and do it in my hometown where I live now in Blue Hill. And in the middle of that, my school board in New Hampshire got attacked by the far right. Oh. And all of a sudden, I found myself in the middle of politics. And I had always had a political interest. I had been one of the first members of People for the American Way, and had always been, you can't be openly gay and not be political. At least at that time, you couldn't. And so I had always been somewhat political, but I responded to that attack. And that became very personal. They shot at my house. They threatened to kill me. They threatened to kill my cats. So went through a 3-year period there, and won repeatedly, kicked the right-wingers out of town, and got the anti-gay measure taken out of the school system that they had put in. But it was an ugly process, one in which I made a lot of friends, too. It's not something I would exchange, not something I would choose to do over, but at the same time, I'm glad I went through it. And then after that, went back to theater. Went to work for one of the oldest summer stock theaters in the country, called the American Stage Festival in New Hampshire. Became their development director and eventually their marketing director. And then that's another one of those. I seem to always be around for the sad story ending. They hired an idiot to run the place, and he ran it into the ground. Oh. I jumped ship just before he finally crashed the thing. Then ran the Mendocino Shakespeare Festival in Mendocino, California for a season and a half. And then started a theater in Stoneham, Massachusetts, north of Boston, called the Stoneham Theater and Ensemble. Got fired from there because the single benefactor decided he wanted his son to run it. But I got to start my dream theater, just somebody else got to run it. And then right when I was recovering from that, my father died, and I ended up moving back to Nebraska. And here, are you familiar with Kool-Aid?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Kool-Aid was invented in Hastings, Nebraska.
Oh, did not know that.
And there is a festival called Kool-Aid Day. And at the time that I was hired to run it, it had 5,000 people, and it was basically parents of preschoolers doing bouncy houses and that kind of thing. It was a very kind of minor event. But I took it over and got Kraft Foods, who owns Kool-Aid now, to donate significant amounts of money, and grew the festival to 50,000 people over a 3-day event, 35 events over 3 days over the entire city of Hastings. And over a 6-year period, grew it to 50,000. And won all sorts of awards. Won Most Outstanding Event in the state of Nebraska twice, Most Outstanding Website in the state of Nebraska once. Got top 100 events in North America from the American Bus Association, the Tour Bus Association. And then got pushed out there for being gay.
Oh, geez.
So I was open the whole time. And I've basically retired since.
Gotcha. And what do you do to pass the time?
Well, I do occasionally come out of retirement. I've done 2 major events. I did 3 years ago. Are you familiar with the Trans-Canada XL pipeline and the controversy about that? There was a concert here in Nebraska in the middle of a cornfield with Willie Nelson and Neil Young, and I stage managed that concert. Oh. I came out of retirement to do that.
Oh, yeah, I would have too.
Yeah. Oh, believe me, being 10 feet from Willie Nelson, being 10 feet from Neil Young, it was, talk about a tick in the book of life. And 7,000 people with all that high energy out in the cornfield. Oh, it was magical. It was absolutely magical. It's a day I will never, ever, ever forget. And also, I was in the middle of running a U.S. Senate campaign for Dave Domina at the time, so I was on a high ground for other reasons. So I had all sorts of wonderful things going on in my life at that time. So it was an incredible adrenaline rush. And then the other thing I came out of retirement for was there was a Bernie Sanders rally in Omaha a couple of years ago that was big. It was, I think we had 9,000 people, something like that, at an arena at University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I did the stage management and the technical management for that rally for the Democratic Party. So every once in a while I get called on to do that kind of thing. I'm known for pulling off the big events. Now, the other thing that I do on a regular basis is I run the local Pride event here in Hastings. And by comparison to Kool-Aid Days, it's a little pocket event. We had all of 300 people show up last year, and 200 of them marched for 1.8 miles. But for Hastings, Nebraska, a town of 25,000, to have 300 people show up for a gay rights event is pretty damn good. And we had no hecklers, and we had almost 30 exhibitors, and it was a great event. It was a really great event, and it's what I'm doing annually now. I do basically I run the whole event. I do all the fundraising. I do all the organizing. I have a committee that kind of oversees and says yes or no to some things, but for the most part, it is what I do, which means like the last 2 months before, so April and May of each year, I'm pretty much working full time just on that to make it happen right. And I love it. I love it. I love events. Kool-Aid Days was frankly a pain in the ass. It was just so much hard work. And when you're selling 9,000 mugs, just hauling the damn mugs becomes an unbelievable, the quantities. We went through over a ton of sugar every year. And so I had to have that ton of sugar delivered to the right place every year, and yada, yada, yada. But so I was, and this particular year that I'm about to tell you the story about, I was burned out. My partner had cancer that year, and I had been in terrible shape in terms of the amount of time that I'd had to give to it. Then our concert had been rained out, and so we had to move the concert at the last minute out of an outdoor venue to an indoor venue, and that had meant tearing down everything that was in the indoor venue beforehand for the earlier part of the day. So it was just this huge effort to move this concert. And I was outside of the concert having a cigarette and kind of gathering my wits about me and asking myself why the hell I did this. Why do I put myself through this? What the hell is wrong with me? And just then the doors next to me burst open and this little 8-year-old boy came out, followed by his parents, and he threw his arms up in the air and he said, "This is the best day of my life." I went, oh, damn. Well, there it is. There it is. It's about creating moments. And that's what theater is, too. And in theater, I'm as much about creating the dark and emotional creative moments as I am about the lighthearted and funny moments. In fact, as a director, I really tend to direct the heavy stuff. I tend to go for The Crucible and Shadowlands and C.S. Lewis and that kind of stuff.
Wow. Yeah, that is some heavy material.
Yeah. But I try to be adaptable. I can direct comedy too, and damn well. But if I have my preference, some people have told me that theater is my church, and I think they're right. It's where I learn, it's where I teach, it's where I live my life's philosophy. And I hope to direct again soon. I direct a show about every 2 or 3 years for the community theater here. Frankly, it's about they're only ready for me about once every 2 or 3 years because I'm a bit of a challenging director. Because I have worked professionally, I tend to put them through their paces in terms of what the community theater can do. But we produce damn fine theater. I think almost every person who has worked with me at this community theater would tell you that at one time or another they hated me, but that also at the same time they would tell you that the shows that we produced were some of the best that the theater has ever produced. That it's just a part of the process. So sometimes you got to make the sausage, and it ain't pretty.
Nah, that's sadly true. But hey, it gets the result.
That's right. Well, and as long as you aren't fundamentally hurting people.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, and let's face it, an artist ultimately does want to get pushed that extra bit to get that performance out there, to give that extra energy, and that's really what a director is there for.
That's right. That's right. And I demand it.
I mean, you don't have to go Kubrick crazy, but
exactly. No, in fact, I have a little lady here in town who has done several roles for me, and she's an excellent actress. I call her a little old lady, but she's also an excellent actress. And she just happens to play my little old lady characters when I need them on stage. And she tells me that I'm her favorite director because I tell her why she's doing what she's doing. Evidently, the other directors that she's worked with don't bother. And I don't understand how any other way to direct. If I don't tell an actor why they're doing what they're doing, then how can they motivate themselves to look like they're doing what they're doing?
Yeah.
And so, but she tells me that the other directors she works with just tell her, stand there, say that, do that. And I say, now in this scene, you're going to be, yada, yada, yada. And I get performances. I get incredible performances out of amateur actors because they understand what it is they're trying to portray.
Yeah. And some people just are hoping that the actor will be able to find that place. But if you don't have a cohesive voice in the form of the director, then, yeah, it's everybody just doing their own thing, too.
There are two kinds of directors. There are directors whose productions succeed because of them, and there are directors whose productions succeed in spite of them. And the in spite of them is, well, no, let me rephrase that. There are two kinds of good directors. And the good directors whose productions succeed in spite of them are because everybody else is so frightened that it's going to go down the tubes that they pull it together and pull off something incredible. Both are about collaboration. It's just that one is leaderless collaboration and the other has a leader.
That makes sense.
So that's what I do these days. I also crochet a lot.
Oh, that's cool.
I have my own little scarf business and sell fashion scarves and winter scarves and that kind of thing. It's just something to do with my hands. I started it during the pandemic. I couldn't stand just sitting or doing nothing. And so I started ordering yarn and crocheting, and I had crocheted for years. And now I have something like 200 scarves that I need to sell. I do not, in case you hadn't noticed, I do nothing on a small scale.
I've kind of noticed that, yeah. Randall, thank you so very much for giving me your time and really giving an insight into a side of the industry that most people don't look at, and then even beyond it, because I gotta say, it's just interesting to see the different paths a life can take, especially a life as varied as yours.
Every year I'm asked to give a speech. There's what used to be Future Homemakers of America. I've forgotten what it's called now, but there's a new organization, and they have an annual conference here, and I'm asked to speak to these high schoolers. And the thing that I always speak about is alternative careers, the careers that you could not possibly imagine in high school. The career opportunities that are going to come knocking at your door along the way that you never would have imagined that you might even be interested in, let alone that you would want to, devote your life to. And I would say that the real secret to my success, if you can call it success, I'm sorry, financially I struggle. But if I weren't struggling financially, I would call myself a great success because I've lived so many lives.
Attention.
Hang on.
To use that job.
There we go. Because I have lived so many interesting ways with so many interesting people. I am successful. It's just I'm not financially where I'd like to be. But the secret to that is recognizing the brass ring when it's going by and having the guts to grab it. Because life is extremely random.
Yeah.
And opportunities come by. And yes, you have to take a risk. And sometimes you have to bet the farm. one of my mentors in the theater who was talking about running professional theaters said that if you don't bet the farm at least once every 3 years, you're not doing your job. That you have to do theater that's out on the edge, because theater is the leading edge of arts. And that if you're not doing something that risks the life of the theater every 3 years, you're not doing your job. And I feel that way about a lot of things, that you've got to take the risk. And you will get beaten up, as my stories tell. You will get beaten up. You will have problems, but you will also have such great rewards. You will live a Felix Dennis lifestyle. You will, meet Bette Midler. You will, that's a whole other story I didn't tell you about, but you will meet Kurt Vonnegut. I spent a whole hour talking to Kurt Vonnegut on a plane once. The things, because I dared to speak up and say, are you Kurt Vonnegut? I had the guts to talk to them. There are so many things in life that if you just screw up your guts, a friend of mine used to have a favorite saying, if you don't ask, the answer is always no.
Very true.
And I think that could be a life's philosophy itself. But I'm very happy. This has been a great time for me, too. It's fun to tell these stories. You've got me thinking that I need to get my website back up and running and start working on my book and blog again.
Definitely.
I had one time started it and then had financial problems, and my website went away. It got erased. I had a significant website that had a lot of these stories on it, and it got erased. And it doesn't exist on any archive or anything. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really sad, but it's a whole nother story. It was a real pretty website too. I was really proud of the design of it, and now I can't find the template that I used, so I can't even read it. Can't even put it back the way it was, because I'm not. There's no way I'm a WordPress designer. I need a template.
Gotcha.
But, see, you have a hard time shutting me up. I've got a lot to talk about.
No. This is content gold. All good.
All right. Well, thank you so much. You were good for me too.
I do my best. Or something. Randall, again, thank you very much, and have a good one.
You too. Take care now. Bye.
Bye.